Chapter 731. Since Emo Shuyao took down Feihong Pass, the anxious occupation immediately changed. The two armies besieging Feihong Pass were beaten to a pulp. After the winter came, the northern tribes' army slowed down. Once winter came, the northern tribes' territory would be covered in ice. Although they had occupied a large area in the north of Dechu State, these places had been destroyed by them in the past 6 months. So when winter came, the northern tribes' army began to run out of food. Emo Shuyao defeated the besieging northern tribes and Shilling army, and headed east to the Chu capital without stopping. Before that, the army led by Morong Shun was gradually approaching the Chu capital. On the other hand, the 300,000 soldiers led by Hisu bypassed the Chu capital and directly clashed with Wei Chen's army in the north. They cut off the northern region army's retreat. Although the appearance of these two armies did not directly solve the siege of the Chu capital, it eased the enemy's attack. The defenders of Dechu State, who had been fighting hard for more than a month, breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, something even more shocking happened in the northern region. The current king of the northern region, Ren Qining's queen, who was the princess of the northern region tribe, and her children all died overnight. But strangely, the children of his concubine were safe and sound. Although the people of the northern region were brave and not wise, they were not stupid. Soon, the news that Ren Qining killed his wife began to spread in the northern region kingdom. Because Ren Qining was not from the northern region, and after he unified the northern region, he appointed many Central Plains people. The seeds of discord between the Central Plains people and the northern region people had been planted long ago. Now that they suddenly broke out, Ren Qining had a headache for a while. However, less than 2 days after Ren Qining suppressed these rumors, his children and concubines also died. This time, it seemed to be done by the people of the northern region. But whether Ren Qining thought it was done by the people of the northern region or framed them, he could only suppress this matter again. Otherwise, the conflict between the people of the Central Plains and the people of the northern region would erupt more fiercely next time. In the study room, Ren Qining looked at the invitation that had just been sent in front of her and almost ground her teeth to pieces. It was a black card with gold paint, with golden clouds and flying dragons drawn on the back. The content of the post was very simple. There were only a few words. If others don't offend me, I won't offend them. If someone offends me, I'll return it 1,000 times over. The few lines of bold and flamboyant words looked unrestrained and domineering. It was more like an undisguised provocation. Ren Qining clenched her teeth and crushed the post into pieces. Emo Shuyao. Ren Qining's originally elegant face no longer had the slightest trace of a smile, only endless distortion and hatred. Emo Xuyao's sudden attack was definitely enough to break Ren Qining's heart. Not only his wife and concubines, but also all his children. Not a single one of his 4 sons and 5 daughters were spared. Ren Qining knew that this was Emo Xuyao's revenge for what she had done to Yi Li and West Hill. But people were always like this. They did not care about other people's pain, but when it came to themselves, they could not bear it. Young master. In the study room, a few men who were obviously from the Central Plains stood solemnly, looking at Ren Qining's twisted face worriedly. They were all descendants of the previous dynasty's officials, who had been loyal to the Lin family for generations. After Ren Qining established a foundation in the northern region, he naturally placed them in important positions in the northern region's imperial court. Compared to the people of the northern region, who fought desperately on the battlefield, they were Ren Qining's true trusted subordinates. Although they, who claimed to be the orthodox people of the Central Plains, were a little uncomfortable with the help of the barbarians of the northern region, they were born at the wrong time. For 100 years, the Central Plains had been guarded by the Prince Ding mansion. Their ancestors could not move at all. Back then, the Prince Ding mansion had suffered a great loss, so they found the opportunity to control the entire northern region. Otherwise, they would still be hiding in the dark as a hermit family. Ren Qining sneered and said, Emo Shuyao sent the invitation. The people of the Prince Ding mansion are really everywhere. What a good move. One of them hesitated for a moment, then asked, This is a matter between the queen and the young princes. Is it Emo Xiuyao's doing? Killing the whole family? Emo Xiuyao is so vicious. Even people like them could not help but tremble at Emo Xiuyao's ruthlessness. Not long ago, Emo Xiuyao had just killed half of the nobles in the Emperor of Shilling City. Now, he had even killed everyone in the royal family of the northern region, except for Enchanting. It was undeniable that such methods were frightening. Could it be that Emo Xiuyao really cares about Princess Ding so much? Or did he intend to do this all along, and just happened to find this excuse? Someone asked suspiciously. Enchanting was silent. Actually, he had only met Emo Xiuyao in Yili once in Xiling last year. However, he could clearly feel that Emo Xiuyao cared about Princess Ding. More importantly, it was because of the influence of the Su family behind Princess Ding in the Prince Ding mansion that he would make a move on Yili. However, he did not expect that this time, he would suffer a double loss. After a moment of silence, Enchanting asked, "How is the battle at the Chu capital?" Reporting to young master. Our troops have already surrounded the Chu capital for more than a month. We believed that we would be able to break through the Chu capital in a few days. However, an army suddenly appeared out of nowhere and cut off the Chu capital's path to the Purple Thorns Pass. This army only has 200,000 people, but the person leading them is not ordinary. They occupy 3 small cities in the middle, forming a triangle. The Ling army has suffered heavy losses. More importantly, they occupy the main road and obstruct us. Our supplies and reinforcements cannot keep up. I'm afraid that the time it will take to break through the Chu capital will be delayed. They never thought that the army could change the entire situation. No matter how powerful it was only 200,000 people. Compared to the million soldiers in the north, it was not enough. It would only delay the time it would take to break through the city. Enchanting frowned slightly and asked, "Who is the person leading the army?" According to what he knew, the Dechu state did not have many generals who could fight. Most of them had been taken to Jiangnam by Emo Jingli. Leng Huai and the others who had been stationed at the Purple Thorns Pass were now trapped in the Chu capital and could not come out to lead troops. The middle-aged man shook his head and said, "We only know that this person is called Hisu. Now that the world is in chaos, Emo Jingli took many people with him when he left the Chu capital. Our people could not find out anything about him in such a short time." "Can't find out anything?" Enchanting rubbed his chin and asked thoughtfully, "Then, could it be Emo Xiuyao's people?" Everyone was silent and looked at each other with suspicion. Although those soldiers did not seem like the Mahist army, who knew if there were other soldiers hidden in the Prince Ding mansion? Also, to suddenly attack like this, it was clear that they wanted to delay the time it took for the north to break through the Chu capital. And now, Emo Xiuyao had also set out for the Chu capital. Therefore, it was reasonable to say that they were trying to buy time for Emo Xiuyao. Enchanting stood up and said, "Pass down the order. Immediately mobilize all the troops. Within 3 days, the army that I defeated will attack the Chu capital at full force. We must take the Chu capital before Emo Xiuyao's army arrives." Everyone acknowledged. "Young master, your plan?" Enchanting narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "If Emo Xiuyao wants the Chu capital, he will have to see if I agree. Send someone to send a message to the 7th prince of the northern tribes. In 10 days, I will invite him to the Purple Thorns Pass." Chapter 732. Everyone looked at each other, their eyes full of confusion. Although they did not understand their master's thoughts, they still respectfully left to handle matters. Although no one knew what the northern tribe's commander, the 7th prince, and the northern region's king, Enchanting, had met at Zijing Pass, 2 secret letters were sent to the west on the same day. One letter was sent to Emo Xiuyao, who was still in the army, while the other letter was sent to the Prince Ding mansion in the northwestly city. In the military tent, Emo Xiuyao leaned lazily on the chair, reading the letter in his hand. Sitting down, Marquis Nan Lu Jingxian, Feng Jiao, and the others were all guessing what had been said in the letter that made the prince's expression become so profound. Feng Jiao was forced to stand up by the other elders' threatening gazes and asked, "Prince, did something happen?" Emo Xiuyao looked at him with a smile that was not a smile and said, "Something did happen. 3 days ago, Yalu Yi of the northern tribes and Ren of the northern Jin kingdom had a chat at Zijing Pass. Everyone understood that these two people walking together was not as simple as an ordinary chat. This clearly meant that the two families were preparing to join forces to deal with the Prince Ding mansion. Marquis Nan frowned and said, "But what did Ren and Yalu Yi come to an agreement?" Emo Xiaoyao said, "They had a secret conversation. What they talked about was not written in the letter. But I can guess a bit. It was nothing more than for the northern tribes to help block the Mahist army's advance, so that the northern region has time to take Chujing." Feng Jiao did not understand. Would Yalu Yi be so stupid? Using his own troops to block Ren Qining? Emo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "He's not stupid. The northern tribe's army is facing us now. They have no choice but to use all their strength. Unless they can defeat the Mahist army, their chances of successfully taking Chujing are not high. But the northern region is different. The northern region is in the opposite direction from us. Before we enter the Chu capital, they won't have any conflicts. Ren Qining must have given Yalu Yi other benefits in exchange for him giving up on Chu capital." What kind of benefits? The Chu capital was not some other place. Even though the Chu state's royal family had moved the capital, it was still very important to the people of the Chu state. Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and laughed. Maybe he gave up some land to the northern tribes. Or perhaps after the Chu capital is conquered, the two families can deal with the Prince Ding mansion in a reasonable manner? LV Songxian frowned and asked worriedly, "If that's the case, it's indeed very disadvantageous for us. What plans does Prince have?" Emo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "Our plan is to get to Chu capital as soon as possible. We can't let the northerners get there first." As for other plans, young Master Qingchen would naturally consider them. As for this Ren Qining, the lesson we gave him this time was not enough. Everyone present, including Feng Jiao at Xiling, looked curiously at Emo Xiaoyao. Their expressions were questioning what Prince had done to him. Emo Xiaoyao said indifferently, "Nothing much. I had Qin Feng send people to kill all of his wives and children." Everyone was silent. Similarly, in the study of the Prince Ding mansion in Glass City, Su Qingchen, Su Hongyu and the others were all present. Yili was wearing a thick ferret cloak and hugging a heater. She was also sitting at the side listening to their conversation. Su Qingze put down the letter in his hand. His usually expressionless face frowned and said, "If the northern tribes and the northern region really join hands to deal with the Mahist army, I'm afraid it won't be so easy for the Mahist army to reach Chu capital next month. Can Chu capital last that long?" Su Hongyu stroked his beard and frowned slightly. "I'm afraid it won't be that easy. Now we can only hope that Prince Ding can be faster." "And the northern region, Li'er, Su is from the Prince Ding mansion?" Yili nodded and said with a smile, "He is indeed from the Prince Ding mansion." Su Hongyu nodded and said, "That's good. With him and General Murong, they should be able to resolve Chu capital's predicament. If not, then it can only be heaven's will." Su Qingchen smiled faintly and said, "Father, you don't have to be so worried. Even if Chu capital is occupied by the northern region, Prince Ding will definitely be able to take it back. Furthermore, it's better for the northern region to take over than the northern tribes." Once the northern tribes entered the Central Plains, they did everything they could. Wherever the army went, there would be rivers of blood. As long as Ren Qining still wanted to rule the Central Plains, he would not be able to kill as much as the northern tribes. Su Hongyu could only think this way. He shook his head and said, "We don't have to care about military matters. However, if the northern tribes and the northern region really form an alliance, it will be very disadvantageous for us." This disadvantage was not only referring to the rescue of Chu capital this time, but also in the future. "Qingchen, do you have any ideas?" Su Qingchen and Yili looked at each other and smiled faintly. "I do have some ideas. The northern tribes and the northern region were not on the same side as each other. The conflict between the crown prince of the northern tribes and the seventh prince, as well as the differences between the people of the Central Plains and the people of the northern territories. We can do something about these." Su Hongyu raised his eyebrows and said, "You mean to divide them from the inside?" Yili nodded and said with a smile, Big brother is right. The northern tribe's 7th Prince Yeluyi is currently leading the army. After today's battle, Yeluye's reputation in the northern tribes will definitely rise, overshadowing the crown prince Yeluhong. Yeluhong and Yeluyi have always been at odds. How can he tolerate this? He will definitely be very dissatisfied with Yeluyi. If someone says anything to the king of the northern tribes, Su Hongyan asked, is this plan feasible? Does the Prince Ding mansion have any spies in the northern tribe's royal family? Yili shook her head and said helplessly, there is no such thing. The northern tribes are very xenophobic. If you are not a member of the northern tribes, you will not be able to gain their trust. However, the crown prince of the northern tribes has our people by his side, and Yelu Hong's relationship with the Prince Ding mansion is much better than Yelu Ye's. Oh, Su Hongyan was curious. Although he had been in the northwest for so many years, he did not know that the Prince Ding mansion had spies by the crown prince's side. Su Qingchen thought for a moment and asked, is it Princess Ronghua? When Princess Zharan's daughter, Princess Ronghua, was conferred the title of princess, she married the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong. However, when Princess Ronghua was in the capital, she did not have a good relationship with the Prince Ding mansion and Yi Li, so it was not easy to guess this relationship. However, it had been so many years. Whether Princess Ronghua had not changed was another matter. Is she reliable? Yi Li smiled and said, it doesn't matter if Princess Ronghua is reliable or not. We don't need her to do anything for us. As long as the people around her are reliable, it's fine. After all, Princess Ronghua was not a trained spy. If there were too many things, it would be easy to give the game away. At that time, the Prince Ding mansion sent 2 spies, one in the open and one in the dark, to help Princess Ronghua secretly. Princess Ronghua naturally knew about the open one, but no one told her about the secret one. Of course, all of this was not really just to help Princess Ronghua, but to meet the needs of the current situation. Now that the capital of Dechu State had moved, almost half of the country was gone. And the news from the northern tribes showed that Yelu Hong did not have the slightest intention of neglecting Princess Ronghua. It could be seen that Princess Ronghua had been doing very well in the northern tribes these years. That's good. Su Qingchen nodded with satisfaction. Yi Li smiled and said, then I will send someone to the northern tribes in person to see Yelu Hong. Maybe I can help him secretly. If everything goes well, in 2 or 3 months, Yelu Yi should be finished as the commander of the northern tribes army. Su Qingchen asked, I'm afraid it's not so easy to persuade Yelu Yi. Do you want me to go in person? This. Yi Li frowned. Now many things in the northwest were inseparable from her eldest brother. But if she did not send someone with enough weight, she was afraid that Yelu Hong would not understand. If it weren't for her pregnancy, Yi Li would have gone there herself. Su Hongyan said, the northwest can't do without Qingchen and my eldest brother. If Lier trusts uncle, I'll go. Second uncle, the northwest is bitter and cold, this trip. Su Hongyan smiled and said, Lier, are you looking down on me or what? Is uncle a person who can't bear hardships? Yi Li naturally knew that although Su Hongyan did not talk much, he was really eloquent and was a suitable candidate. She looked at Su Qingchen and Su Hongyu hesitantly. Su Hongyu nodded and said, so second brother will go. Hearing Su Hongyu say so, Yi Li could only nod. She thought for a moment and said, so Mo Hua is also in the northwest. I'll let him bring some people with him to accompany second uncle. Mo Hua was originally the commander of the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion. With him and his people protecting Su Hongyan, there was no need to worry about his safety. Even if the plan failed, Mo Hua could protect Su Hongyan and safely return to the northwest. Okay. Knowing that Yi Li was thinking about his safety, Su Hongyan did not refuse. Chapter 733. Before the new year was over, Su Hongyan had brought Mo Hua and the others to the grassland beyond the Great Wall, which was covered in ice and snow. Needless to say, the hardships of the journey were needless to say. The people defending the Chu capital were also not in the mood to celebrate the new year. Even with Morong Shun and Hisu's support, The attacks of the northern tribes seemed to have weakened after a few days, while the army of the northern tribes seemed to be getting stronger. Moreover, there were more and more northern tribes attacking the Chu capital. In the end, Hisu's troops could not withstand the pressure of nearly 1 million soldiers and retreated from the battlefield early. However, Hisu, who had retreated from the battlefield, did not remain silent. Instead, he led his troops and regrouped with Morongshen's troops who were engaged in battle with the northern tribes. The two armies charged towards the besieging northern tribes. After defeating the northern tribes, they continued to pursue the western tribes. This allowed the Dechu state troops defending the city to have less to worry about and focus on the northern tribes. On the other hand, if they could continue west and regroup with the Mahist army at the Prince Ding mansion, it would also save a lot of time for the Mahist army to arrive. Because the enemy was surrounding the city, there was no festive atmosphere in the Chu capital. After the first snowfall, the northern army's siege was suspended. The northern tribes were bitterly cold. After the snowfall, the entire city wall was covered in ice. It was more than 10 times harder to attack than usual. On the city tower, Du Hua, Leng Huai, Leng Haoyu and the others stood on the tower and looked into the distance. The camp of the northern tribes was clearly visible in the snow-white world. Leng Haoyu looked into the distance and sighed. The northern tribes have sent more troops. Du Hua narrowed his eyes and said, I'm afraid it's not just more troops. Even the northern tribe's king has come personally. He pointed into the distance. The flag in the center of the camp was the northern tribe's king's flag. In order to boost the morale of the northern tribe's army, the news of Ren Qining's arrival was not hidden. Naturally, he did not mind letting the Chu capital garrison know. Leng Huai frowned in confusion. Why is there a 5-clawed golden dragon embroidered on the royal flag? The Central Plains, the Dechu state, and the Xiling were all formed from the same lineage. Therefore, their flags and royal insignia were mainly made up of dragon and phoenix totems. However, this was not the case for the foreign races in the outer realms. For example, the northern tribes worshipped wolves, so the totem of the royal tribe of the northern tribes was a wolf head. On the other hand, Nanzhao used flowers as their totem. Most of the tribes in the northern region had beasts as their totem, but none of them had a dragon as their totem, which was an illusory divine creature. Leng Haoyu leaned against the cold city wall and said with a smile, because the current king of the northern region, Ren Qining, claims to be the orphan of the royal family of the previous dynasty. What? Leng Huai and Du Hua were both shocked. Leng Huai said with some doubts, the previous dynasty has been destroyed for 200 years. Can this Ren Qining's identity be taken seriously? Leng Haoyu shrugged and said with a smile, who knows? Anyway, he is from the Central Plains. No one can control whether he is a descendant of the previous dynasty or not. If he wants to fight for the world, he must have a reason. Leng Huai and Du Hua looked at each other. Du Hua smiled and said, Second young master Leng is right. No matter who he has no right to fight for the Central Plains with the reputation of being the orphan of the previous dynasty, just because he brought the people of the northern region to attack the Central Plains. It's better to start a rebellion. It won't be so ugly. As a legitimate descendant of the previous dynasty's royal family, he brought a group of barbarians to attack the Central Plains. It wouldn't sound good if word got out. Moreover, the self-proclaimed orthodox scholars of the Central Plains had always despised the barbarians. Ren Qining's actions were even more unacceptable to the orthodox scholars. Leng Haoyu smiled unruly and said casually, the northern region is not an iron plate now. The people of the northern region have always been at odds with the Central Plains people who Ren Qining put in an important position. This time, Prince has put on a good show in the northern region. I'm afraid that the headquarters of the northern region is now divided on the inside. Oh, as soon as these words came out, Leng Huai and Du Hua couldn't help but perk up their ears curiously. Naturally, they didn't know that Prince Ding, who was still hundreds of miles away, had already done something to the northern region. This was originally not a secret, but now that the Chu capital was besieged, the news was blocked, so the people in the Chu capital didn't receive the news at all. Leng Haoyu didn't hide it. A malicious smile appeared on his lips, and he said, A few days ago, Prince had people kill all of Ren Qining's wives and children. Within a few days, all of Ren Qining's concubines and children were also killed. Now the royal family of the northern region can be said to be Ren Qining alone. Du Hua and Leng Huai were shocked. Prince Ding's actions were not only ruthless, but also endless. This was not as simple as taking revenge on Ren Qining. It was likely that the people in the northern region secretly blamed the deaths of the northern region's princess and children on Ren Qining and the Central Plains people. In the eyes of outsiders, the deaths of Ren Qining's concubines and children were more like the revenge of the people of the northern region. Even if Ren Qining herself knew the truth, how many people would believe her if she told them the truth was another matter. When Prince Ding came up with this plan, he was probably still far away in West Hill. It was not a lie that he could so easily manipulate the hearts of the people of the northern Jin kingdom and strategize to determine victory from 1,000 miles away. Du Hua and Leng Huai looked at each other and couldn't help but sigh. Prince Ding was so talented and wise. The brothers Mo Jingqi and Mo Jingli really deserved to lose. Leng Haoyu leaned against the wall and looked at the camp of the northern region in the distance. A cold smile flashed across his eyes. The country had already fallen, so they should just stay put. Trying to revive the country was just a dream. They actually wanted to break into the Chu capital and let the people of the northern region take over the Central Plains. Sooner or later, they will all die. The royal family of the northern region was almost wiped out. The news of the alliance between the northern region and the northern tribes naturally spread to the south. However, the two forces of the south, Mo Jingli and Enchanting, did not do anything other than gloat. Enchanting even sneered. He only felt that the depression in his heart for the past 2 months had dissipated a lot. If not for Ren Qining's interference, even if the Emperor of Shilling changed hands, his forces would not have been wiped clean by Mo Xiaoyao. However, his attention was not focused on the north. Instead, it was focused on the Emperor of Shilling, who had just moved the capital to An City, and Mo Jingli in the south. Mo Jingli was still well-behaved. However, after moving the capital, the Emperor of Shilling was somewhat restless. The Jinnan Palace's influence in the imperial court had been mostly reduced by Mo Xiaoyao. Now Teng Feng was actually somewhat unable to suppress the Emperor of Shilling. Although the Western Tomb had lost a third of its land in the north, Enchanting had also taken over a large area of land in the south of Dechu State. After Morong Shun led his troops to the north, he even opened up a path to the southwest. Once again, he connected the land occupied by Enchanting to the Western Tomb. In this way, the Western Tomb did not suffer too much from this battle other than losing the imperial city. However, Enchanting knew that the biggest winner of this battle was actually Mo Xiaoyao. Once he took over the Chu capital, the Prince Ding mansion would have 2 imperial cities under its control. Its power would immediately surpass that of the other countries. However, even though he understood this, Enchanting could not find the time to deal with Mo Xiaoyao. He could only grit his teeth and endure. However, after Ren Qining personally came to the Chu capital to supervise the battle, the northern army's attacks became more and more intense. The defenders in the city had been under siege for nearly 3 months. Not only were they tired, but the food reserves in the city were also gradually running low. Not to mention the millions of people in the city who also needed to eat. Even on the day of the new year, whether it was the people or the defenders, each person only had a bowl of plain porridge. The days of defending the city became more and more difficult. In order to boost morale, the elderly Duke Hua had to personally supervise the battle. Chapter 734. It dragged on until the 91st day of the first month. The Chu capital had been defending for 3 months and 10 days since the northern region's army arrived, a total of 103 days. Perhaps knowing that the Chu capital was truly an arrow at the end of its flight, the northern region's army took turns to go into battle without any signs of tiredness. The morale of the siege also increased. On the city wall, Leng Huai and Du Hua stood side by side. Their determined faces were full of fatigue and hardships. Behind them were Leng Haoyu, Leng Qingyu, Wei Lin, and the other young generals. Lung Haoyu, who had always been unruly, had a rare solemn expression on his face. Lung Huai looked at the northern region's army that was eyeing the city covetously and said helplessly, "Old Duke, I'm afraid we can't take it anymore." There was not only helplessness in his words but also some regret. They had endured for 3 months, without the Chu capital falling. As generals and subjects, they had not let down the Chu state. It was a pity that they could not wait for the Maoist army's reinforcements. A trace of sadness flashed across Duke Hua's old face. He looked at the fluttering flags in the distance and said in a calm and determined voice, "Even if the Chu capital falls, this old man will live and die with the Chu capital." Lung Huai nodded. "Old Duke is right. This general also has the same thoughts. If the city stands, the people will live. If the city falls, the people will die." Lung Haoyu strolled down the city wall. The current situation was indeed a little troublesome. It was naturally not difficult for him to escape alone. But Lung Haoyu had also experienced a lot in the past few months of defending the city. He was also a descendant of a general. Although he had never been on the battlefield before, it was impossible for him to abandon his comrades who had fought side by side and escape at this time. Moreover, his father and wife were still in the city. "Prince, if you hadn't come, I, Lung Heir, would have really died here." Lung Haoyu smiled bitterly. "Second brother." Lung Haoyu was stopped by a voice behind him as soon as he turned the corner. Lung Haoyu could guess who was behind him without looking back. She pursed her lips and turned to look at Lung Qingyu, who was wearing a white robe with a cold expression. The white rolling snow lion battle robe was also stained with a lot of dust, making it look even more murderous. Lung Haoyu had always had nothing to say to this brother of his. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "General Lung, what's the matter?" Lung Qingyu frowned. "I have something to tell you." Lung Haoyu raised his eyebrows. Ignoring the dust on the wall, he leaned back and said lightly, "I'm all ears." Lung Qingyu looked at him and asked, "What do you look down on me for?" Lung Haoyu smiled but didn't say anything. Of course he looked down on him. As the son of a concubine and the son of the first wife, they were destined to have a bad relationship. Lung Haoyu hadn't been doted on since he was young, so he naturally disliked Lung Qingyu, who was doted on and cultivated by his father. When had Lung Qingyu, the son of the first wife, ever taken Lung Haoyu, the younger brother of a concubine, seriously? When Lung Haoyu gradually grew up, he befriended Mo Xiuyao, Feng San, and the others. After learning some skills, his initial dislike for Lung Qingyu turned into disdain. So what if you're praised by father? You're doted on and cultivated by father, but your martial arts aren't as good as mine. Even if you're on the battlefield, you might not be able to fight better than me. It's just that I don't care to compete with you. Therefore, Lung Haoyu was very carefree after saving Lung Huai at Purple Thorns Pass. It was like a person who could only feel good in secret, but now he could feel good in front of everyone in the world. The feeling was self-evident, especially when he saw Lung Qingyu's gloomy and cold face every time Lung Huai praised him. The joy in Lung Haoyu's heart doubled. Lung Qingyu snorted. "It doesn't matter if you look down on me. Anyway, I don't know if I can survive this time. If I die, take good care of father." Huh. Lung Haoyu was stunned. He thought Lung Qingyu wanted to quarrel with him or something. It turned out that he was here to leave his last words. Lung Haoyu pursed his lips and waved away the strange feeling in his heart. "If you want to leave your last words, go find your son. What does it have to do with me?" Then he turned and walked forward. Lung Qingyu's voice came from behind. "In short, if I die in battle, you'll be the Lung family's only son. Take good care of father." Then, he turned and walked up the city wall without looking at Lung Haoyu's reaction. Lung Haoyu was stunned for a moment before he came back to his senses and shouted at Lung Qingyu's back, "What does your death have to do with me? I don't care about your Lung family." Before Chu Jing, who was guarding the city, could take a breather, the Northern Region army began to attack the city again. This time, the attack was even more intense than before. They watched as the defenders on the city wall were shot down one by one. They watched as the army below the city wall crossed the moat and climbed up the city wall tower. After being shot down by the defenders, some people continued to climb up. The sounds of killing filled the entire city wall. and the thick smell of blood lingered in the air. Finally, under the heavy impact, the sturdy city gate collapsed, and a large group of northern region troops poured in. On the city wall tower, Duke Hua picked up the silver spear in his hand and glanced at the people still fighting on the city wall tower. Leng Huai, guard the city wall tower. Leng Huai was stunned and hurriedly asked, Old Duke, what are you? Duke Hua said in a deep voice. This old man will go down and meet these northern region people. Then, without waiting for Leng Huai to refuse, he strode down the city wall tower. His light blue battle robe fluttered in the cold wind, making people feel as if they were seeing the Duke Hua, who was in his prime, and galloping on the battlefield. The city gate was only so big. Although the city gate was broken, the Chu army guarding the city immediately rushed over, intending to block the northern region people. The two groups of people fought at the city gate. However, the northern region people were valiant and brave. How could these tired and hungry Chu state soldiers resist them? Chu Jing was beaten back step by step. The northern region soldiers continued to pour into the city. If this continued, there would be no point in guarding the city wall tower. Leng Huai could only order the soldiers to retreat into the city and fight on their own. This battle to defend the city had been fought for more than 3 months. At this point, it was already a battle to the death. In less than an hour, the sounds of killing had spread throughout the entire Chu capital. Although there was Ren Qining's order to restrain them, the soldiers of the northern region were not that strict. Many houses had been destroyed, and it was common for treasures to be stolen. If the citizens of the city resisted, they would also die under the blades of the northern region soldiers. This city that had flourished for hundreds of years had suddenly become hell. The smell of blood wafted through the air, and cries shook the heavens. The center of the Chu capital was the imperial palace. Now there were not many guards left in the palace. The large imperial palace was so quiet that there was almost no one in sight. In the depths of the palace, a young man and woman sat in each other's arms. The young girl had a beautiful appearance. Unfortunately, half of her face was covered in scars, which made her beautiful appearance look even more strange. Little brother, are you afraid? The young girl was noble consort Lu's daughter, Princess Jin Ning. Sitting beside her was naturally noble consort Lu's eldest son, Emo Xiaoyan, who had been conferred the title of Prince Chongqing by Emo Jingli. Emo Xiaoyan shook his head and said, I'm not afraid. Sister, don't be afraid. I will accompany you. Emo Xiaoyan comforted his sister softly. The shouts outside the palace walls were getting closer and closer. A few guards rushed over, and one of them said in a deep voice, Princess, the northern region soldiers are about to attack. Your Highness and Princess, please follow us and leave this place. Chapter 735. Emo Xiaoyan shook his head and said indifferently, There's no need. You guys should go and help Duke Hua and General Leng, my sister, and I won't be going anywhere. Princess Jin Ning held her brother's hand and nodded. That's right. I'm the princess of Chu State. Even if I die, I want to die in the palace. You guys go yourselves. You guys won't be able to stop anything. It'll be a waste of your lives here. The guards looked at each other and understood that the prince and princess had made up their minds. The imperial household of the Chu had abandoned the people, and the imperial household and fled. While these soldiers who had stayed behind did not have good feelings about the imperial household, they felt more respect for this brother and sister pair. They stood up and cupped their hands. Since that's the case, Princess, take care. Looking at the departing figures of the guards, the palace regained its original tranquility. The brother and sister sat together. Although it was the cold of the first month, the palace was no longer as warm as before. The two of them leaned against each other and felt a little warmer. I wonder how little brother is doing. Back then, they had stayed in the Chu capital, but little brother was taken away by Emo Jingli. He might have wanted to use this opportunity to control Emo Xiaoyan. Emo Xiaoyan said in a low voice, He should be alive. I just hope he's safe and sound. I just can't accept it. I still haven't found that woman. Princess Jin Ning caressed the scar on her face with a disgusted expression. She still hadn't found that woman to take revenge. That woman who was originally her mother had ended up like this because of her. Even in death, she had to die with such an ugly scar. Sister. In the city, fighting from dawn to dusk, more and more places were occupied by the people of the northern region. The remaining Chu army's area of activity was becoming smaller and smaller. Everyone had long felt despair and helplessness. Even more people charged into the northern region's army, with bloody determination in their eyes. Even if they had to die, they wanted to drag a few people down with them. Outside the city, Enchanting stood on her horse and listened to the sounds of fighting in the city. The general next to her said, "The Chu people have always been weak. I didn't expect them to be so courageous. Fighting until now, they're about to be completely wiped out, yet they still refuse to surrender." Enchanting said indifferently, "It's not that they're weak, but they're resilient. The people of the Central Plains were not as brave as the people beyond the Great Wall, but they were tenacious and indomitable. Therefore, this rich land has been ruled by them for thousands of years." The northern general next to him seemed to be unconvinced, but he looked at Enchanting and didn't say anything. Suddenly, a flame-like spark blossomed in the sky, and a rumbling sound came from afar. Even the ground was faintly shaking. Enchanting sat up straight on his horse. He waved his whip and cursed, "Yellow ye that trash." The general next to him was shocked. "The Mahist army has arrived? Apart from the Black Cloud cavalry, who else has such power?" Enchanting said bitterly and shouted, "Send more troops into the city. We must take Chu capital before the Mahist army arrives." Yes, the people fighting in the city naturally saw the fireworks in the sky. Lung Haoyu's eyes lit up, and he kicked away the northern soldiers in front of him. He flew to a high place and shouted, "The Mahist army is here. Open the west gate." Luckily, the west gate was still in the hands of the Chu army. Hearing this, all the Chu army soldiers were shocked. Soon there were people who shouted, "The Mahist army is here. The Mahist army is here." The shouts quickly spread throughout the city, and even many people who were originally hiding in their homes cheered. Some people who knew martial arts even ran out to fight with the northern soldiers. As for the streets and alleys, there were even more northern soldiers who were hit with sticks. The west gate of Chu capital was opened, and the Chu army in the city also rushed to the west to ensure that the west gate would not be taken over by the northern soldiers before the Mahist army arrived. The Black Cloud cavalry was as fast as the wind. Originally, it sounded like they were still a few miles away, but soon, they saw the black troops rushing into the city like a black whirlwind. The main road of Chu capital was very wide, and the Black Cloud cavalry did not feel crowded at all. Wherever the black whirlwind went, a bloody light would appear, sweeping everything in its path. Seeing the Black Cloud cavalry, Lung Haoyu finally let out a sigh of relief. He grabbed a Black Cloud cavalry soldier and asked, "Has the army arrived?" He was so excited that the soldier almost rolled his eyes. He quickly opened his eyes and said, "The infantry is a bit slower. Our cavalry will go first." Lung Haoyu was slightly disappointed. "When will the army arrive?" The Black Cloud cavalry said, "I don't know." "Who's leading the Black Cloud cavalry?" "Third young Master Feng." Lung Haoyu threw away the Black Cloud cavalry soldier and ran towards the west of the city. When he killed his way to the west gate, he saw Feng Jiao standing under the city gate with a smile. "Oh, it's rare to see second young Master Lung in such a sorry state." Saying he was in a sorry state was an understatement. Lung Haoyu was covered in blood, and there were wounds all over his body. Fortunately, there weren't any serious injuries, and it didn't affect his movements. He rolled his eyes at him and said, "Duke Hua and the others are trapped near the palace. Quickly send people to save them." Feng Jiao's expression changed. He waved his hand and called for a group of people to enter the city. However, he himself had to stand guard at the city gates for the Mo family army that would arrive later. If the Mahist army arrived, and the city gate was taken by the northern army, then it would be troublesome. Lung Haoyu took a deep breath and asked, "How many people did you bring?" Feng Jiao was helpless. "How many people can the Black Cloud cavalry have?" 20,000. Lung Haoyu nodded. "It should be enough to wait until the prince arrives." Lung Haoyu naturally knew that the Black Cloud cavalry valued quality over quantity. He ignored Feng Jiao and waved his hand, bringing two groups of Black Cloud cavalry towards the city. Chapter 736. Because of the arrival of the Black Cloud cavalry, the victory that seemed to be within their grasp gradually became more difficult. The Chu capital that had been gradually losing seemed to have suddenly become much stronger. Even though the northern army outnumbered the Chu capital by more than 10 times, in these narrow city streets, it was futile no matter how many people they had. Moreover, the Chu army's understanding of the Chu capital was far above the northern barbarian army. Even if they could not chase the northern army out of the city, it was impossible for them to completely occupy the Chu capital in a short period of time. Feng Jiao stood on the city gate tower and looked down at the battle in the city from above. He gradually discovered that the northern army had completely ignored the Chu army and were crazily charging towards the western part of the city. A cold smile appeared on his handsome face. "You want to take the western gate? How could it be that easy?" Enchanting, who was following behind Feng Jiao, crossed his arms and looked at the northern army that was charging over. He said, "They want to take the western gate first and cut off the Mahist army's path into the city. Then they will deal with the defending army in the city?" Feng Jiao said with a smile, "Don't worry, before we left, the prince gave me a few good toys." However, Feng Jiao said with a frown, "This toy seems to be a bit dangerous. Using it in the city might be a bit." Enchanting did not have such misgivings. "What kind of time is it now? Why are you still worrying about these things? When they really charge over, we won't even be enough to deal with them." Feng Jiao rubbed his chin and nodded. "That's right. Actually, I don't know what this toy is like either. You take your things and block those fellows." He turned around and waved his hand, calling over a small Qilin captain that came with them. The Qilin members were naturally excited. They had obtained this item for quite some time, but they never had the chance to use it. After receiving Feng Jiao's order, the squad leader waved his hand and immediately led a group of Qilin down the tower with a rectangular box in their hands. In the city, the soldiers of the northern region who received Ren Qining's order all rushed towards the tower of the west gate. However, from the street far away from the west gate, they only heard a loud bang followed by a series of explosions. Before the northern army could even figure out what was going on, they were blasted to bits and pieces of flesh and blood. If they were Central Plainsmen, they would at least have seen some fireworks and firecrackers. But the barbarians in the northern region lived a slightly better life than the primitive tribes before Ren Qining integrated the northern region. They had never seen such earth-shattering noises and destructive power. Many soldiers of the northern region were so frightened that they assumed that they had offended the heavenly god, and that the heavenly god had sent down a bolt of lightning. Needless to say, those who were hit by the explosion were so scared that they knelt on the ground and didn't dare to get up. Uncivilized peoples were often more afraid of heaven and earth than the peoples of the Central Plains. After a series of explosions, the entire street was filled with the smell of gunpowder. The ground was also covered with soldiers who had been blasted into pieces. On the tower not far away, Enchanting's eyes widened in shock. He stammered, This thing was given to you by the prince? This was a little too frightening." He clearly saw that Qilin and the others had hidden something along the street. Those northern region people had become like this as soon as they entered. If Yili were here, she would definitely think that these effects were just SOSO. After many years of research in the secret Imperial Mausoleum, the best thing they had made was not even as effective as the first-hand grenade, let alone a powerful bomb like TNT, which could blow up a 6- or 7-story building with just 1 kilogram. As for the firearms developed in the underground palace of the Imperial Mausoleum, Yili was too lazy to even take them out. Whether it was the range or the accuracy, they were inferior to bows and arrows. It was better to wait for another 4 or 5 generations before thinking about it. However, to the people of this era who still knew how to play with fireworks and firecrackers, this effect was shocking enough. Feng Jiao nodded with a wooden face. At the same time, he concealed the shock in his heart. However, he could not help but curse Immerse in his heart. If he had such a powerful weapon, he should have taken it out sooner. In fact, Immerse was definitely wronged. Now these things were purely handmade, and there was no flowing production line. It was already considered a high yield if 7 or 8 bombs could be made in a month. However, these things were not particularly lethal. Chelan's people had placed no less than 100 things on both sides of the street, due to the earth-shattering lethality just now. It was too inconvenient to carry around, and had a high production cost. Emo Xiuyao really didn't plan on using something that wouldn't kill 3 people in an open area for the time being. The northern region soldiers could only be considered unlucky. With so many people squeezed into this narrow street, who else would they bomb if not him? The northern region people were not completely brainless. Soon, someone reacted and shouted, "This is a trick of the Central Plains people. Don't be afraid. Charge and kill them." The northern region people were brave. With someone taking the lead, they quickly got up and followed the leader to charge forward. The Qi Lin on the houses on both sides were not surprised. They smirked and viciously threw the black objects down. The black ball landed on the ground and exploded while the soldiers of the northern region were stunned for a moment. The soldiers closest to the ball were sent flying as expected. Then, another deafening explosion sounded on the street, accompanied by the cries of the northern region people. When the explosion stopped, the surviving northern region soldiers finally could not take it anymore. They threw away their helmets and armor and ran away. The violent explosion in the west of the city was heard by everyone in the Chu capital. Even Ren Qining, who was outside the city, heard it. His eyes turned cold as he asked, "How could it be?" Soon, someone stumbled out of the city and reported, "Your Majesty, the Mahist army has monsters. Our soldiers have suffered heavy casualties." Ren Qining was so angry that his face turned green. "I want to know what kind of monster is so powerful," the reporting soldier said with a trembling voice. The soldiers didn't even see clearly what it was. They only heard an earth-shattering boom. Then many people died with blood all over their bodies. "You mean you didn't even see the Mahist army?" Ren Qining asked. The soldier thought for a while and nodded. "They did not see the Mahist army." "Bastard. I don't care what kind of monster the Mahist army has. Take the West Gate Fry in 2 hours." The soldier hesitated for a while and said, "But many soldiers said that it was a punishment from the gods. That was why the heavenly thunder came. They did not dare to go." Ren Qining sneered and said, "Heavenly thunder? Where would the heavenly thunder come from on a clear day? If there is a heavenly thunder, it will strike I first. Send the order. If we can't take the West Gate in 2 hours, we will take the head of the commander." "Yes." Seeing the soldier who sent the message leave with a face full of fear, Ren Qining's ashen face became even more twisted and ferocious. "Heavenly thunder? Ridiculous. Emo Xiuyao. Did you really get the treasure left behind by the ancestors?" Ren Qining was different from Tan Jiji. He grew up in a big family that was truly hidden from the world. The people who taught him were all old officials of the previous dynasty, who had always been loyal to the previous dynasty. Naturally, he had also read many books about the previous dynasty. There were even authentic copies of the previous dynasty that did not exist in the world. Among them, there were some personal letters written by the previous dynasty's founding ancestor. There were some obscure things mentioned in them. Originally, Ren Qining did not care. After all, the founding ancestor did not use those things when he conquered the world. Later generations of emperors also did not see any powerful mysterious weapons. Whether they were real or fake was still up for debate. But at this time, thinking about the matter of the previous dynasty's treasure in the northwest, what else did Ren Qining not understand? At that time, he was busy suppressing the tribes in the north that did not obey him. However, he still sent people to the northwest to pay attention to this matter. However, they did not find any treasure. The people who wanted to fight for the treasure also returned in defeat. He did not expect that Emo Xiuyao really did secretly get it. Chapter 737. What a good Emo Xiuyao. I want to see just how strong you are. Ren Qining snorted and gritted his teeth. The battle in the city lasted from dusk to night. The capital, which should have been quiet in the past, was still brightly lit, and the sounds of battle shook the sky. On the west gate, Feng Jiao and Yunting were also waiting. Yunting looked at the flames in the city and frowned. If the army doesn't arrive in time, I'm afraid we won't be able to hold on much longer. Feng Jiao frowned. The prince said he would arrive, so there won't be a problem. As long as the West Gate doesn't fall into the hands of the Northern Army, everything will be resolved once the Mahist army enters the city. Although he said that, Feng Jiao also knew the difficulties involved. They had been blocked and attacked by the Northern Army along the way. It was already not easy for them to reach the capital in such a short amount of time. Moreover, the Black Cloud cavalry was several times faster than the infantry. It would be extremely difficult for the army to arrive in 2 to 4 hours. Yunting was not someone who worried too much. He sighed and said, "You're right. No matter what, we just have to defend the West Gate." Feng San. Not far away, Leng Haoyu rushed over in his bloody clothes. However, there were more scars on his body than when he left. "When will the army arrive?" Leng Haoyu asked in annoyance as soon as they met. Feng Jiao rolled his eyes and reached out to support him. "They'll arrive when they can. Do you think it was easy for us to come here? That lunatic Yilu Yi mobilized almost all of the Northern Army in the Dechu state to stop us." Leng Haoyu panted and leaned against the city wall. "If the prince doesn't come, we really won't be able to hold on." "I know," Feng Jiao said. "If they delayed for another half a day, not to mention the soldiers in the city, they wouldn't be able to hold on. He might not be able to hold on here either." Although the soldiers of the northern region were afraid of the minefields that Qi Lin had placed on the streets, there were already several groups of people who had tried to force their way through. Although they were beaten back, if they were to do it again, they would have to fight in close quarters. Qi Lin had used up all the bombs he had brought with him, and he had already turned around to kill the enemy. Yunting said, "Big brother Leng, you should rest here for a while. I'll go down." After saying that, Yunting lifted his spear and was about to walk down the city gate tower. Leng Haoyu pulled him over and said, "Don't go. You have to guard the city gate with Feng San. I still have to go look for someone." Currently, there was fighting everywhere in the city, and it was a complete mess. Leng Huai and the others had been separated for a long time. Chu Jing was not small, so it was very difficult to find someone in this situation. But Leng Haoyu had to go. But Yunting looked worriedly at Leng Haoyu's wounds. Leng Haoyu patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, "It's just a superficial wound. It doesn't matter. I'm going." "Wait." Feng Jiao stopped him, and a smile of ecstasy appeared on his face. "The army is here." Everyone turned their heads to look, and sure enough, they saw a fire dragon moving quickly towards them from afar. At first, it was only faintly discernible, but after a while, it became very clear. Not to mention, there was also the sound of horse hooves gradually approaching. Feng Jiao shouted loudly, "The army is here, open the city gate." Immediately, there was a burst of cheers from the city gate tower. The first to arrive was still the Black Cloud cavalry. In the dark night, the Black cavalry quickly rushed through the city gate and rushed into the city without stopping. Then they clashed with the northern soldiers in the city. After a while, everyone on the city gate tower saw the white-haired Emo Xiuyao, who was dressed in white, riding his horse. "Prince is here! Prince is here!" Red fireworks bloomed in the night sky once again. Chu Jing, which was originally filled with killing and blood, was now filled with cheers and laughter. On a street in the east of the city, Wei Lin and a few soldiers were surrounded by a large group of northern soldiers. There were already piles of enemy corpses around them, but there were even more enemies standing in front of them. Fresh blood still soaked his black clothes, but it was impossible to see in the night. His cold eyes swept across the northern soldiers, who were glaring at him like tigers watching their prey. Wei Lin sneered and raised the sword in his hand, drawing a cold light and a bloody light at the same time. After fighting nonstop for an entire day, even Wei Lin was a bit tired, not to mention the ordinary soldiers beside him. Very quickly, the soldiers beside Wei Lin also collapsed. Wei Lin's eyes were bloodshot as he quickly waved his sword and killed his way into the enemy. Just as these northern soldiers were rejoicing that they were finally going to get rid of this troublesome person, A group of soldiers wearing clothes completely different from those of Chu Jing, and the northern army charged over. The person in the lead was tall and straight, and his appearance was handsome and solemn. The blue frost sword in his hand glittered coldly. Wherever it went, the northern soldiers who couldn't dodge in time were all killed. With the addition of this new force, the situation of the battle was instantly reversed. Who are you? The person at the head of the northern soldiers roared unwillingly. The person on the horse glanced at him proudly and waved his sword without hesitation. This general is Hisu. Big brother. Wei Lin looked at the man in military uniform in surprise. Wasn't this an E who he hadn't seen for many years? An E. Hisu strode forward to support Wei Lin and smiled. Xiao Si, I haven't seen you for so many years, how are you? Wei Lin nodded. We're all good, but Big Brother was sent out on a mission by the princess. He hasn't come back yet. Although they knew that an E was sent out on a mission by the princess, they didn't know what the mission was. In the past few years, they had been secretly worried about him, but they didn't expect that when they met again, he had already become a general leading troops to war. Hisu smiled. The princess said that compared to others, I was more suitable to lead troops to war. So she asked me to anonymously become a soldier under General Morong's banner. Later, after moving around, I didn't disappoint the princess after so many years. Congratulations, Big Brother. They were both from the Shadow Guard, and they were both brothers of the princess's Shadow Guard. Wei Lin was naturally happy for Hisu's achievements. Hisu smiled. I also heard people say that you guys are also doing well. The prince has already led the army into the city. Your injuries aren't light. Go to the west of the city and rest for a while. Although Wei Lin was wearing black and couldn't see his injuries, Hisu wasn't an ordinary person. Naturally, he could see that Wei Lin's complexion wasn't good. He was afraid that his injuries weren't light. He called a few soldiers to escort Wei Lin to the west of the city. Hisu took his subordinates and continued to clear out the northern soldiers in the city. It wasn't until dawn that the sounds of fighting in the city gradually stopped. But there were still some small places where the fighting continued. The soldiers of the Mahist army were still shuttling through the streets and alleys to search for the remaining northern soldiers and the wounded in the Chu capital. The sky was slightly bright. Mo Xiaoyao led a group of soldiers and stood on the north wall of the Chu capital, looking down at the northern army camp in the distance. Although there were still hundreds of thousands of northern soldiers outside the city, the Mahist army didn't put them in their eyes. After this battle, not only did the northern army fail to take the Chu capital, but they also lost countless soldiers. Not to mention their military strength, just their morale had dropped by more than one level. Chapter 738. After the bloody battle just now, even the heavens seemed to show some compassion. The sky had just brightened when fine snow began to fall from the sky. Mo Xiaoyao did not wear a cloak. He was still dressed in white as he stood on the city gate tower amidst the fine snow. Looking up from below, he looked like a god overlooking the mortal world. Even from such a distance, Ren Qining and the generals of the northern region still felt an indescribable pressure. Prince, we've found Duke Hua. A guard hurried over to report. Mo Xiaoyao turned around and asked, where is he? The guard hesitated and said, Duke Hua is in the south of the city. He's heavily injured. I'm afraid. Everyone's heart sank. They naturally understood what the guard meant by, I'm afraid. Mo Xiaoyao was silent for a moment before saying, I'll go take a look. General Lu, I'll leave this to you. Lu Songxian did not say much and nodded silently. Duke Hua was in a small alley in the south of the city. When the Mahist army soldiers found him, he was already heavily injured and could not move. Not far from him were the corpses of northern and Dechu state soldiers. Duke Hua had been stabbed by a sword. The sword had not been pulled out yet. He sat alone on a stone block not far from the alley entrance to rest. The winter nights in the Chu capital were not much warmer than the northwest. Duke Hua was already nearing 80 years old. With such heavy injuries, his face was already a bit pale. Old Duke. Mo Xiaoyao stepped forward and supported Duke Hua. He glanced at the military doctor in front of him and asked, What's wrong? Why aren't you treating Duke Hua? Du Hua raised his hand to stop Emo Xiuyao. He shook his head and said, "No need. I know my own injuries. I can't take it anymore." Emo Xiuyao lowered his head to check the sword wound. His expression also darkened. Du Hua's injury was at a vital point. If he was in his prime, there might be some hope. However, in Du Hua's current state, he would probably die the moment he pulled out the sword. Emo Xiuyao closed his eyes and said in a low voice, "Old Duke, we are late." Du Hua shook his head and glanced at Emo Xiuyao. "I know it's not easy for you either. To be able to arrive in time and prevent Chu capital from falling into the hands of the Northerners. Very good." Emo Xiuyao lowered his eyebrows and pondered for a moment. Then, he placed one hand on Du Hua's shoulder and channeled true qi into him to prolong his life. At the same time he ordered, "Go find the people from the Hua clan." The guard at the side hurriedly reported, "They've already gone. If the Hua clan's people are all right, they should be here soon." Hearing Emo Xiuyao's words, Du Hua smiled and asked softly, "How are Tian Xiang and the others?" Emo Xiuyao replied in a low voice, "They're doing very well. Tian Xiang has already arranged for Qingfeng to get married in a few months. Qingfeng, come here." Su Qingfeng hurriedly came forward and said respectfully, "Old Duke." Du Hua raised his head with some difficulty and smiled. "The children of the Su family are all good children. Very good. This old man won't be able to see you get married. From now on, treat Tian Xiang well." Su Qingfeng's eyes reddened as he nodded. "Yes, old Duke. Grandfather. Good child." The sound of hurried footsteps came from outside the alley, and a young man hurriedly ran over. "Grandfather. Grandfather." Du Hua raised his head and looked at him. A trace of relief flashed in his eyes before he slowly closed them. "Grandfather." When the young man arrived, he just happened to see Du Hua smiling with his eyes closed. He couldn't help but kneel in front of him and cry loudly. To the side, a trace of sadness flashed in Emo Xiuyao's eyes as he slowly withdrew the hand he had placed on Du Hua's shoulder. He ordered in a low voice, "Du Hua sacrificed himself for the country and died in battle. Passed down the order to be buried with the rights of a marquis, and be posthumously conferred the title of Marquis of Loyalty." This subordinate obeys. The same sad scene played out in many places in the capital. In this battle, the number of people who died was uncountable. Not only were there the Chu capital garrison, but there were also the Black Cloud Cavalry and the Mahist army. Not only were there ordinary soldiers, but there were also many high-ranking generals. In another place, Lung Haoyu struggled to support his seriously injured body as he looked at the person lying on the ground in front of him. There was a complicated look in his eyes that no one could understand. Lung Huai knelt on the ground, holding his eldest son's cold body in his arms. When they found Lung Qingyu, he was already dead. An arrow had hit his chest, hitting his vital point. This man, who had always been cold, proud, and unwilling to admit that his concubine's younger brother was better than him, finally died quietly on the streets of Chu capital without leaving a word. Lung Huai hugged his son's cold body as tears streamed down his face. No matter what, this was the son he doted on the most and had placed the most hopes on. The pain of losing his son was more painful than letting him die. Lung Haoyu stepped forward silently and squatted beside Ling Huai. He whispered, "Father, take big brother back first." In the end, the equally proud Lung Haoyu was finally willing to admit that this man was his elder brother. Lung Huai looked back at Lung Haoyu, and his gaze fell on the wound on his chest. He asked, "How's your injury?" Lung Haoyu said, "It's just a superficial wound. Father, let's go back." Lung Huai nodded. He carried Lung Qingyu with some difficulty and walked in the direction of the Lung residence with Lung Haoyu. Chapter 739. In the capital of Chu, the newly arrived Mahist army replaced the exhausted defenders of the Chu state on the city gate tower. Looking at the black flag on the city gate tower, and the soldiers in black standing upright in the cold wind, the army of the northern region had to give up temporarily and did not dare to act rashly. Emo Xiuyao led the crowd into the imperial palace of the Chu state. A trace of melancholy involuntarily flashed across Emo Xiuyao's cold eyes as he looked at the majestic, yet somewhat desolate imperial city in the thin layer of snow. However, there was more of an indescribable complexity in his eyes. As soon as he walked into the imperial palace, Missouri Xiaoyan came out with Princess Jining to welcome him. When he saw Emo Xiaoyao, he also went forward and bowed respectfully. Xiaoyan pays his respects to Uncle Prince Ding. Emo Xiaoyao glanced at Emo Xiaoyan indifferently. He naturally didn't have a good impression of Emo Jingqi and noble consort Lu's son. However, Emo Xiaoyan in front of him was a little inferior to Emo Jingqi. He raised his eyebrows and looked at the two people in front of him, asking, "Where is Great Elder Princess?" Emo Xiaoyan lowered his head and said, "Great Elder Princess passed away 2 days ago, but she was worried that it would affect the morale of the soldiers guarding the city, so she asked us to keep it a secret. Great Elder Princess's coffin is still in the Imperial Palace, and Zhaoyang Elder Princess is still keeping vigil." Emo Xiaoyao nodded and went to pay respects to Great Elder Princess first. Great Elder Princess was 2 years older than Du Hua, and she didn't suffer too much illness before she died, so she could be said to have died of old age. After paying respects to Great Elder Princess in the palace where her coffin was temporarily placed, Emo Xiaoyao greeted Zhaoyang Princess. Zhaoyang Princess was dressed in plain clothes and didn't wear any makeup. Her face was full of unconcealable fatigue and haggard. The two sat down in the side hall. Zhaoyang Princess looked at Emo Xiaoyao and said with relief, "Originally, I thought that you couldn't make it, and the Chu capital would really fall into the hands of the northern region." Fortunately, Emo Xiaoyao calmly told him about the battle in the city, including Du Hua's death. When Zhaoyang Princess heard this, her eyes turned red. She sighed and had nothing to say. After a moment of silence, Zhaoyang Princess asked, "What do you plan to do with the 2 children?" Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and looked at Zhaoyang Princess. Zhaoyang Princess sighed and said, "I didn't like those 2 children at first. What good can a woman surnamed Lu and a child raised by the Lu family be?" However, after spending some time with them, she realized that these 2 children were very different from their parents. If possible, give them a way out. "I know you hate the Dechu State's royal family. I hated them too." Emo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and thought for a moment before saying, "Don't worry, as long as they don't do anything, I won't touch them." Zhaoyang Princess was startled by his distant words. She nodded and said, "If that's the case, thank you." It seemed like they hadn't seen each other for a long time, but it also seemed indescribable. The atmosphere in the side hall made the two uncomfortable. Soon, Emo Xiaoyao stood up and left. Looking at his departing figure, Zhaoyang Princess sighed helplessly. She knew where this sense of alienation came from. From now on, this kind of palace was still surnamed Emo, but it was no longer the Emo of the past. And she was still the Dechu State's princess, no matter how much she hated them. Fortunately, she was now just a fallen princess. With the Mahist army holding the fort, the Chu capital quickly became lively again. 2 days ago, the city was covered in blood, and the sounds of killing filled the sky. The people in the city hid in their homes and trembled in fear. Yet in just a few days, people buried the corpses and cleaned up the streets. Soon, the empty city became more lively. Emo Xiaoyao quickly gave the order to confer posthumous titles to the soldiers who had died in battle, and reorganized the government of the Chu capital. Even though there were still hundreds of thousands of northern troops surrounding the city, the lives of the people in the city gradually returned to normal. Right now, there were not just hundreds of thousands of Mahist army in the Chu capital, but also many Mahist army and Dechu state generals. The people naturally did not worry about the enemy outside the city. After the two armies rested for half a month, Emo Xiaoyao once again ordered the Emo family army to split into 2 groups. One group was led by LV Songxian to rush out of the city to meet the northern army, not giving the other party a chance to recover their strength and attack the city again. The other group was led by Morong Shun to fight the northern tribe's army led by Yelu Yi. In the same month, Dechu State's Prince Chongqing, Emo Xiaoyan, announced to the world that the Mahist army and Prince Ding had saved Chongqing City. From then on, Chongqing City and the people under its rule were under Prince Ding's command, and were no longer subjects of Dechu state. Once this announcement was made, many people were so angry that they wanted to vomit blood, but there was nothing they could do. Among them, the angriest was Mo Jingli, who was entrenched in Jiangnan. The Dechu state had given up the capital. Now that Prince Ding had rushed thousands of miles to save the capital, the people in the capital were willing to submit to Prince Ding. The Dechu state's imperial court was like a mute. The Mahist army had just taken over the Chu capital, and their morale was at its peak. Morong Shun and the southern marquis, who was guarding Feihong Pass, attacked from both sides, forcing the northern tribes' army to retreat. In addition, the northern tribes' army was short on food and could not withstand months of hard fighting. Both sides had to call a truce. The northern tribes' army had not achieved anything after months of hard fighting. There were also some internal conflicts. Helplessly, Ren Qining could only give the order to retreat from Zijing Pass and return with hatred. Thus it was spring in March. Although much of Dechu state's territory was still in the hands of the northern tribes and the northern tribes. However, in a short 7 to 8 months, the Mahist army was invincible from east to west, and then from west to east. This was enough to prove that this famous army was still strong. Thus, the Mahist army's territory stretched from Shilling's Omping continent to the west, to Dechu state's Zijing Pass to the east. Although the territory was slightly smaller than Shilling's, it was still much larger than Dechu state's imperial court in Jiangnan. More importantly, Prince Ding's family owned the two imperial cities in the east and west. Their reputation was second to none in the world. After more than half a year of fighting, both sides had used up countless amounts of money and food. For the time being, no one had the energy to continue fighting. Thus, even though the various armies were still eyeing each other covetously, they all had the will to stop and recuperate. Once the fighting stopped, Mo Xiuyao threw the large and small matters of the Chu capital to Feng Jiao, Lv Songxian and the others. Then he quickly rode back to the northwest. The Mahist army knew that the Wangfei was pregnant. They understood the prince's anxiety and did not say anything. Li. In the middle of April, although spring came later in the northwest, it was already late spring. In the garden of the Prince Ding mansion, all kinds of beautiful flowers were still blooming. Among them, the most beautiful ones were the peonies that had been transplanted from Yunzhou. All kinds of peonies competed to be the most beautiful, making the entire garden appear elegant and luxurious. Their fragrance filled the air. Yili sat on a stone stool covered with thick cushions in the garden. She smiled as she watched Mo Xiaobao wield a small sword and focus on swinging it. Lung Junhan and Su Zhurui, who were watching from the side, also cheered. Even though Yili suspected that the two little ones didn't know what was good and bad. Under the light green cloak, his round belly was already very big. Yili smiled as she watched the sword dance, and gently caressed the round belly. Even though it was already 9 months, the belly was too big. Mo Xiaobao had not been this big in the beginning. Thinking of how Dr. Lin had mentioned that this could be twins, Yili smiled faintly. There was nothing wrong with twins, but she had not told Mo Xiuyao about this. Otherwise, with his personality, it was possible that he would abandon the soldiers on the battlefield and run back. Chapter 740. Hearing the sound coming from outside the garden, Yili was slightly startled. She couldn't help but think, could it be that she was hearing things in the late stages of pregnancy? Mo Xiaobao, who was dancing with the sword, heard this and blinked. He turned to face Yili and pursed his lips. Nyangqin, Fuwang has returned. Although her tone sounded like she was unhappy, her pair of big black eyes suddenly lit up. Yili turned her head and saw a certain person covered in dust standing at the entrance of the garden looking at her with a smile. Li, I've returned. Xiuyao. Seeing that she was about to stand up, Mo Xiuyao quickly jumped into the garden and supported Yili, saying, Don't move, you. Looking at the round belly in front of him, the usually calm Prince Ding couldn't help but widen his eyes and look worriedly at Yili. Li, are you all right? Why is he so big? Dr. Lin said that he might be twins, so naturally he's much bigger than one. Yili said with a faint smile. What? Mo Xiuyao felt his vision darken, and his limbs go soft. One was enough to make him worried and afraid, but there were two. How could it be like this? Where is Shenyang? Have him quickly come over and take a look at Wang Fei. Mo Xiaoyao said anxiously. Yili glanced at him in annoyance and said, Don't you know that Sir Shen went to Fourth Brother's place? Dr. Lin has already taken a look at me. I'm fine and the child is also fine. But, no buts. Yili said firmly. She pulled Mo Xiaoyao and said, Why don't you wash up and rest after coming back? I came out for a walk, and will go back soon. Go back and rest first. Mo Xiaoyao was already scared out of his wits, and could only allow Yili to pull him away. The three children behind him looked at each other. After a long while, Su Zhirui blinked and asked with a handsome face as serious as his father's, We didn't pay our respects to uncle. The youngest child, Lung Junhan, touched her head and said, Uncle Prince Ding won't be angry if he doesn't see us. Uncle Prince Ding didn't even spare them a glance. But, thinking of Uncle Prince Ding's cold eyes, little dummy Lung shook her little head. If he didn't see it, then so be it. It's good that he didn't see it. Mo Xiaobao proudly stared at his father's back as he walked away. He snorted and raised his little head. I don't care if he sees me. Let's go find eldest uncle. The three little buns gathered together for a discussion, and agreed that Mo Xiaobao's suggestion was not bad. Eldest uncle was much more amiable than father. After returning to the main courtyard where the two lived, Mo Xiaoyao came out after bathing and freshening up. Yili had already ordered people to prepare some of Mo Xiaoyao's favorite dishes, and put them on the table. These days, Mo Xiaoyao was in a hurry to return to the northwest and didn't eat much. Seeing these dishes, he couldn't help but have an appetite. He sat down and pulled Yili to eat together. Now wasn't the time to eat, and Yili didn't feel hungry. She only ate half a bowl of porridge and then stopped. She sat on the side and watched Mo Xiaoyao eat. From time to time, she would pick up some meat for him. After so many years, Mo Xiaoyao was still a picky eater. If it wasn't for Yili personally picking up food for him, he would only eat vegetarian dishes. He was even more sage-like than Su Qingshan. As they ate, Mo Xiaoyao talked about some things that happened in the Chu capital. Naturally, he didn't forget about Duke Hua dying for the country. Yili had a good impression of Duke Hua, and was naturally very sad to hear about his death. I'm afraid that I will have to tell Sister Hua and Tian Xiang about this. Mo Xiaoyao said, You don't need to worry about this. I will have someone tell them. The children are more important. Wait until these two are born. Yili thought for a moment, and could only nod. The children will be born next month. When the children are 1 month old, it will be grandfather's birthday. With a frown, Yili gently stroked her round belly and said, If that's the case, then we won't hold the children's 1 month old celebration. It wasn't a small matter to hold Prince Ding's young master and young Juanju's 1 month old celebration. If it was held together with grandfather's birthday, then they wouldn't have to do anything in the next 2 months. Mo Xiaoyao didn't have any thoughts on whether to hold the children's 1 month old celebration. He only raised an eyebrow and asked. Back then, Mo Xiaobao's 1 month old celebration was a big one. Won't these two be unhappy when they grow up? Yili smiled and said, Prince Ding is concerned about the relationship between siblings? What can a 1 month old celebration be? If he is unhappy because of this, then it's because we, as parents, didn't teach them well. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and smiled as he looked at Yili's belly. It's not that Father King is biased towards you. It's your mother's idea. Is Lier here? Su Qingshan's elegant voice came from outside the door. The servant girl guarding the door quickly bowed and said, Prince Ding just returned. Wang Fei is accompanying Prince Ding to eat. Hearing their voices, Mo Xiaoyao instantly became unhappy. He had just returned, and hadn't even gotten a chance to rest. Why did Su Qingshan come to find him? Couldn't he just let him rest? Yili didn't sense Mo Xiaoyao's unhappiness. She laughed and said, Dagu, come in. Su Qingshan stepped into the parlor, and looked at Mo Xiaoyao, who was staring at her with a dark expression. A hint of a smile appeared on her lips. When did Prince Ding come back? We didn't even know. Yili said apologetically. He just arrived and went straight back to Yuan. Does Dagu have anything to do at this time? Of course, Su Qingchen couldn't say that she knew Mo Xiaoyao had just returned and purposely came to annoy him. She said with a smile, "It's nothing major. It's just that in 2 months, it's about time to draw up the invitation for grandfather's birthday. I happen to have some free time today, so I came to discuss it with you." Yili frowned slightly and thought for a moment before saying, "The Northwest, Xiling, and the Chu capital naturally have to be invited. But the other places, Nanzhao northern border, Xiling, and Jiangnan should be invited?" Mo Xiaoyao put down his bowl and chopsticks. He raised his eyebrows and said, "Of course. Last year was such a big change. Even if we don't invite them, they will come themselves." Su Qingchen nodded and said, "I know. Also, does Prince Ding plan to host it in the Chu capital or Li City?" This was also a problem. If it was hosted in the Chu capital, it meant that Mo Xiaoyao would move the Prince Ding mansion back to the Chu capital. If it was hosted in Li City, then the Chu capital would have to be reconsidered. After all, it was a capital city, and it was different from the Emperor of Shiling's city. The Emperor of Shiling's city could be said to have been picked up for free. It would be best if they had it, but losing it wouldn't be a big loss. But the Chu capital was surrounded by enemies. If it was lost, it would be a huge blow to the Prince Ding mansion's reputation. Mo Xiaoyao rubbed his eyebrows. He thought for a moment and asked, "Big brother, what do you think?" Su Qingchen smiled and said, "This kind of big matter is naturally decided by the prince." Mo Xiaoyao rolled his eyes at him and said proudly, "I order you to say it." Su Qingchen didn't care. He shrugged and said with a smile, "Li City is still too small. If we want to build it on a large scale, it can't be completed in a day. With the prince overseeing the Chu capital, it will be a good deterrent to the people in the northern border and southern border." In other words, Su Qingchen still preferred to move the Prince Ding mansion back to the Chu capital. Chapter 741. Mo Xiaoyao naturally understood that Su Qingchen's words made sense. After thinking for a moment, he asked, "The Chu capital is too far away from the Western Tomb. If something happens there in the future, we won't be able to help." Glass City also had its advantages. For example, it was located at the center of the continent. If they weren't strong enough, they would be attacked from all sides. However, if they were strong enough, this place could expand in all directions. Su Qingchen said, "We can't give up on Glass City. However, we don't have a way to expand Glass City to a sufficient size in a short time. Now that the world is in chaos, it's not a good thing to waste manpower and resources." To put it bluntly, Glass City was too small. Originally, if the Prince Ding mansion only guarded this small piece of land in the northwest, there wouldn't be much to say. However, the territory under the Prince Ding mansion's control was no smaller than any other powerful country. If this continued, it would make people feel that it was too shabby. It would make the soldiers and officials feel unconfident. Because Prince Ding clearly didn't have any plans to ascend the throne, no one knew what the Prince Ding mansion would be like in the future. Su Qingchen had been handling all kinds of government affairs in Glass City for a long time. Naturally, he knew all the doubts and rumors among the officials and citizens. In the current situation, if they didn't expand Glass City, they would have to move the Prince Ding mansion back to the Chu capital. Mo Xiaoyao pondered for a moment. He raised his head and said, "Mr. Qingyun's birthday banquet will still be held in Glass City. After that, I and Miss Li will temporarily be stationed in the Chu capital. Mr. Qingchen, you should go as well. Everything in Glass City will remain the same." Su Qingchen was a bit helpless. He smiled and said, "Since the prince has decided as a subordinate, I can only follow his orders. Does the prince plan to operate both Glass City and the Chu capital at the same time?" Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said, "Right now, the terrain we occupy stretches from east to west. The distance between east and west is too far. If something happens in the west, it will be too late by the time the news reaches the Chu capital. Also, after taking care of Renqining, the Chu capital's role will be greatly reduced. When the time comes, the Western Hill and the northern tribes will be the focus." the closest place to the western hill, and the northern tribes was obviously Glass City. Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and smiled. Prince is indeed ambitious. However, I have a question that I haven't asked, and I'm sure that many of you are already very perplexed. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and looked at Su Qingchen with a smile. Prince, have you never thought of ascending the throne? Su Qingchen asked. If it was in the past, I wouldn't be surprised if the prince didn't care about the Prince Ding mansion in the northwest. But now, the Prince Ding mansion covers thousands of miles from east to west. Why did the prince? This question indeed puzzled many people. Not only the subordinates of the Prince Ding mansion, but even outsiders could not see through Mo Xiaoyao's thoughts. If it were anyone else who had such a vast territory, they would have long since claimed to be the overlord. Unlike Mo Xiaoyao, who did not have any self-awareness in this regard. Mo Xiaoyao held Yi Li's hand and smiled amiably at Su Qingchen. No other reason. Not interested. Not interested. Su Qingchen frowned and couldn't help but roll his eyes in his mind. Young Master Qingchen was naturally calm and easy to accept. If it were anyone else, such as Feng Jiao and the others, they would probably pounce on Mo Xiaoyao and shake him by the collar. Are you playing with us? Are you playing with us? Su Qingchen was only surprised for a moment before regaining his composure. All right, it wasn't like he was going to be the emperor. If he wasn't interested, then so be it. Actually, ascending the throne was just a ceremony and a title. In the Prince Ding mansion, who dared to say that Mo Xiaoyao's authority was not as great as the empress? To hell with the legitimacy. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Su Qingchen with some disdain. Since young Master Qingchen is fine, you should go back first. I am a bit tired and want to rest for a while. The husband and wife were reuniting after a long separation. What was he doing here? Su Qingchen acted as if he didn't see his gaze and smiled at Yi Li. Since it's like this, Li you should rest well. I will take good care of Xiaobao and the others. Hearing this, Yi Li's face was filled with dejection. She actually left the 3 children in the garden and left. Was her mind really muddled because of pregnancy? Big brother, are Xiaobao and the others with you? Sorry to trouble you. It's no trouble. It's just that Xiaobao told me sadly that his father didn't even want to look at him and left. Su Qingchen's smile was like a spring breeze. Mo Xiaoyao laughed coldly and said lightly, then I'll have to trouble young Master Qingchen to take care of them. After all, Mo Xiaoyao likes eldest uncle the most, right? Speaking of favorite, Mo Xiaoyao couldn't help but grit his teeth. He deeply felt that he had raised a little white-eyed wolf who lived off him while helping others. Seeing that Mo Xiaoyao was really going to carry the children away, Su Qingchen didn't tease him anymore. She smiled and bid farewell. In the reception pavilion, Yi Li looked curiously at Mo Xiaoyao. She wanted to say something but stopped. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her with a smile. Why is Li looking at me like that? Have you discovered that your husband has become more handsome after not seeing him for so long? Yi Li looked at the sky speechless. You really don't plan to ascend the throne? Mo Xiaoyao gave a light snort and said carelessly, what's so good about ascending the throne? I'm always worried that someone will steal my throne. Occasionally, when I want to play around, I'll be scolded by the imperial censors. When I want to kill someone, I'll have to listen to the long-winded lectures of those old men. Most importantly, I have no interest in accepting the daughters of those old men who can't marry. Could it be that Li wants your husband to have 3 palaces and 6 courtyards? And actually it's not impossible. After your husband ascends the throne, I'll order that the future emperor can only have 1 empress and no concubines. Then, I'll kill all those old men who like to criticize me. Your husband will be a tyrant. What do you think, Li? Yi Li only felt a wave of powerlessness. She waved her hand and said, let's talk about ascending the throne later. Chapter 742. In less than a month, the news of the Mahist army occupying the Chu capital had spread throughout the great rivers North and South Pass. In an instant, all the nobles who had been scheming against each other had calmed down. In a short span of less than 10 years, Prince Ding's residence had actually changed from being suppressed by Emo Jingqi to a behemoth that could compete with anyone under their eyes. Many people regretted that they didn't take advantage of the Prince Ding mansion's weakest moment to stab them a few times. Now they had an unpredictable and powerful enemy. However, looking at the Mahist army soldiers guarding the city like wolves and tigers, the people who were ready to make a move couldn't help but retract their steps. It was true that the desire to destroy the Mahist army was strong, but everyone knew that the hunter would shoot the bird that sticks out. If they couldn't help but make a move and fight to the death with the Prince Ding mansion, it would only benefit others. While the people in power of each country had their own thoughts and plans, the Prince Ding mansion in Glass City was in chaos. The usually quiet and warm main courtyard was in a clamor. There were a few people sitting or standing in the parlor, all of them looking restless. There were also many people standing in the courtyard outside the parlor, waiting anxiously. If one had been in the Prince Ding mansion for a long time, they would definitely remember that this scene had played out once 7 years ago. That's right. Today was the day that the Prince Ding mansion's new member was going to be born. In the parlor, Emo Xiaoyao sat on the main seat with a calm expression. However, if one looked carefully, they would find that his body was already stiff. If it wasn't for him trying his best to control himself, he might have already rushed into the room. Although he had already experienced it a few years ago when he gave birth to Emo Xiaobao, it was because he had experienced it that he felt even more terrified. Furthermore, when she gave birth to Emo Xiaobao, there was only one. This time there were two. Everyone in the parlor had the same goal of distancing themselves from Emo Xiaoyao. Even the mischievous Emo Xiaoyao, who usually made his father uncomfortable, tactfully distanced himself from Emo Xiaoyao and lay in Mr. Qingyun's arms. Yili wasn't someone who liked to scream when she was in pain, so when she was giving birth, it didn't sound as scary as the average pregnant woman. Qin Zheng, who was sitting by the side, could not help but recall the time when she gave birth to Su Zhiruei. It was said that the entire Su manor could hear the screams. Su Qingze, who had always been cold and stern, was so scared that he fainted the moment he heard that the child was born. Compared to Yi Li's current situation, she suddenly felt that she had lost too much face. Emo Xiaobao stared at the maidservants carrying water in and out from time to time. He leaned into Master Qingyun's arms worriedly, and his dark eyes were filled with fear. Master Qingyun patted his little great-grandson tenderly and said softly, "Chen-er, don't be afraid. Your mother is fine. Chen-er, do you want to go out and play with Zhiruei? When you come back, brother and sister will come out." Emo Xiaobao shook his head and said, "No, Chen-er wants to wait for brother and sister to be born." "Great-grandfather, was it very painful when mother gave birth to Chen?" Master Qingyun smiled and said, "Yes, every mother will be very painful when giving birth to a child. So Chen-er must be filial to mother in the future. Do you understand?" Emo Xiaobao nodded heavily and said, "Chen-er knows. Chen-er will be filial to mother. Chen-er likes mother the most." Good boy. There were also many people standing in the courtyard outside the door. Not only the people of the Prince Ding mansion, but also Hua Tianxiang, Han Mingxi, Yi Wenhua and others. The parlor was too small to have a place to sit. They had to wait anxiously in the courtyard closest to it. In the bedroom, Yili was lying on the bed and enduring the waves of pain. Her face was a little pale. Second Madame Su anxiously watched the midwife busying herself. She could only hold Yili's hand and said, "Li-er, don't be afraid. If it hurts, just cry out." Yili squeezed out a smile at Second Madame Su. This birth was indeed more painful than the last time when she gave birth to Emo Xiaobao. There was a sharp pain, and Yili finally couldn't help but cry out in pain. Second Madame Su wiped the sweat on her forehead and asked, "What's the matter? How long will it take to give birth?" The midwife was a little embarrassed and said, "I'm afraid it will take a while. The position of the little heir's fetus is a little wrong. We have to adjust the position of the fetus." Second Madame Su's face darkened. She had also given birth to 2 children, so she naturally knew the trouble of having a wrong fetus. "Then hurry up. You know the identity of the princess consort. Don't let anything happen to her." The midwife nodded and said, "Madam, don't worry. The princess consort's condition isn't serious. There won't be any problems. It's just that the princess consort will have to suffer a little. Yili also heard their conversation. She nodded slightly and said, "It's okay. You can do it." The midwife then went forward and adjusted the position of the fetus. Second Madame Sue held Yili's hand and comforted her in a low voice. "Don't be afraid, Leah. Relax. When Aunt gave birth to your third brother, the position of the fetus was also wrong. Don't worry." Yili nodded and endured the waves of pain. From day to night, other than Yili's painful cries, there was no sound of the child crying. Emo Xiaoyao, who had been sitting on the main seat, finally couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and was about to walk in when Master Qingyan hurriedly called out, "Stop." Emo Xiaoyao paused and continued to walk forward. Master Qingyan said in a low voice, "If it's for Lear, don't go in for a long time. If you go in, will the midwife still dare to move?" These words weren't false. Emo Xiaoyao's pressure right now, not to mention the midwives, even the people sitting in the parlor couldn't take it. Qin Zheng had already held Emo Xiaobao's hand and waited outside the door. He was afraid that if Emo Xiaoyao went in, the midwives would panic even more. It wasn't rare to make a mistake in the chaos. Emo Xiaoyao's cold air kept blowing out. He turned back to look at Master Qingyan. After a while, he finally turned back and sat down in his original position. But that sharp gaze didn't make people doubt that he wanted to blow open the closed door with one palm. Everyone waited until dawn before the first sound of a baby crying came from the room. The originally solemn and worried crowd seemed to wake up in an instant and stood up one after another. Emo Xiaobao also ran in from outside. "Mimi, I heard Mimi's voice." Then he ran towards the door. But the door was still closed. Emo Xiaobao didn't leave and just waited at the door. After a while, another sobbing sound was heard. Everyone finally heaved a sigh of relief. Not long later, Madame Sue and a midwife each carried a child out. She smiled and said, "A son and a daughter, mother and child are safe." She brought the children in front of Master Qingyan. The two wrinkled little red monkeys made Master Qingyan very happy. Good children. How is Lear?" Second Madame Sue smiled and said, "After being tired for a day and night, she fell asleep." "Father, look, this is big sister, and this is little brother." Master Qingyan nodded happily and said, "Women are good, very good, very good." Chapter 743. Emo Xiaobao pulled second Furin's clothes and couldn't wait. Grandaunt, China wants to see his brother and sister." Everyone couldn't help but laugh. When second Furin turned around to give the child to Emo Xiaoyao, there was no sign of Emo Xiaoyao. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when the child was born safely. After waiting here for a day and night, they were all very tired. Especially Master Qingyan, who was 80 years old and couldn't bear the fatigue. Seeing Yi Li and the child were safe, Su Hongyu hurriedly ordered Qin Zheng and Su Qingze to help Master Qingyan back to rest. Everyone else also dispersed to rest. Only second Furin still needed to spend some effort to look after the two children with the midwife. Yi Li woke up from a deep sleep. There were candles in the room, and it was already dark outside. She habitually raised her hand to touch her belly, and found that the round belly that had accompanied her for several months was flat. Her entire body was sore as if someone had taken it apart. She moved her body, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw a head of silver hair spread out by the bed. She saw Emo Xiaoyao lying on the bed, holding one of her hands and sleeping soundly. When Yi Li moved, Emo Xiaoyao quickly opened his eyes. Seeing Yi Li open her eyes and look at him, his sleepy eyes suddenly bloomed with joy. "Li, you're awake." Yi Li nodded and raised her hand to smooth his messy hair. She asked softly, "How long have I slept? Where are the children?" Emo Xiaoyao looked outside and said, "It's already 5 o'clock. You've slept for almost a day and a night. The children?" A trace of confusion flashed through Emo Xiaoyao's eyes. He hadn't seen the children yet. "Someone come." Qing Shuang and the others who had been waiting outside heard the sound and quickly came in. Princess is awake?" Seeing Yi Li wake up, Qing Shuang was also very happy. "This servant will have someone bring the hot porridge prepared for Wang Fei." Emo Xiaoyao stopped her and asked, "Where is the child?" Qing Shuang smiled and said, "Young master and young Canton princess are sleeping outside. This servant will ask Mama to bring them in." After speaking, Qing Shuang bowed and hurriedly turned around to leave. Not long after, Mother Lin and Mother Wei each came in with a swaddle in their arms. She carefully placed the swaddling clothes on the empty space on the bed beside Yi Li. She smiled and said, "Princess consort, quickly take a look. The little heir and the little princess are very good looking." Yi Li looked down. Although she already knew what a newborn baby looked like, she still couldn't help but feel embarrassed. With her eyesight, she really couldn't tell what was good about these two wrinkled and red little monkeys. But in the end, they were her children. Looking at the two little things sleeping comfortably with their eyes closed, Yi Li felt her heart soften like cotton. Lovingly touching the little babies' red faces, Yi Li couldn't help but smile. Mother Lin said, "Princess consort, the one in red is the little princess, and the one in yellow is the little heir. The little princess looks exactly the same as Princess consort when she was young." Yi Li's mouth twitched. In any case, she couldn't tell how the little bun looked like her. She smiled and looked at Emo Xiaoyao asking, "Xiaoyao, take a look." Emo Xiaoyao originally didn't have much interest in the two little buns. Hearing Mother Lin's words, he looked over. After looking for a long time, he looked at Yi Li's face and nodded. They really do look alike. I's little princess will definitely be as beautiful as Princess Li in the future. So this person didn't actually see it, but it was a beautiful wish. Yi Li had already slept for a day and a night. When she woke up, she was a little hungry. After eating a bowl of meat porridge that Qing Shuang had carefully prepared, Emo Xiaoyao was finally sent to rest. Emo Xiaoyao hadn't had a good rest since Yi Li started acting up and was about to give birth 2 days ago. Now that he saw with his own eyes that Yi Li was safe and sound, he finally let out a sigh of relief. After Yi Li finished her porridge, she got up and went to rest. Yi Li, on the other hand, had slept for too long, so she couldn't fall asleep. She placed the two little buns, whose eyes hadn't even opened, on her bed to look at them. Looking at the two babies who were still sleeping soundly with their eyes closed, Yi Li's heart was filled with tender feelings. She bent down and kissed the two wrinkled little faces. When the sun had just risen, Emo Xiaobao, who had received the news that Yi Li had woken up, ran over. He didn't let anyone report his arrival, and ran into the bedroom. Yi Li raised her head, and saw him poking his little head into the room. She couldn't help but smile and ask, "What are you looking at? Why aren't you coming in? Is Father Wang not here?" Emo Xiaobao looked around the room, as if confirming that Emo Xiaoyao really wasn't here. Only then did he walk in with relief. He ran in small steps to Yi Li, and looked at the two babies lying side by side on the bed. "Mother, are you all right?" Yi Li lightly smiled and rubbed her son's little head. She smiled and said, "Mother is fine, so I came to see little sister and little brother." Emo Xiaobao climbed onto the bed, and knelt on the bed to look at the two little buns. He stretched out his little hand and curiously poked at them, asking, "Little sister and little brother, why do they look like wrinkled little monkeys? They don't look good at all." Yi Li quickly grabbed his mischievous little hand and said with a smile, "After a few days, they will become white and chubby babies. Xiaobao also looked like this when he was just born." "What?" Emo Xiaobao was puzzled, but there was also a little disdain and disbelief. How could he be so wrinkled and ugly? Aunt clearly said that he was a white and chubby baby when he was born. But, looking at his sleeping and well-behaved little brother and sister, they actually weren't that ugly. Emo Xiaobao nodded heavily in his heart. Even if his little brother and sister were a little ugly, he would still love them very much and treat them very well. He treated them even better than Xiao Daileng and Su Zhirue. "What are you thinking about?" Looking at Emo Xiaobao nodding and shaking his head with a thoughtful expression, Yi Li raised her hand to touch his little head. Emo Xiaobao smiled and said, "Mother, Xiaobao will love little brother and sister very much." Yi Li smiled and said, "Mother knows that Xiaobao will be a good older brother." The last time Yi Li gave birth to Emo Xiaobao, she didn't have a full month of confinement like other people. In her previous life, it wasn't uncommon for many women to run around after a week after giving birth. As for the Westerners, There was no such thing as a full month of confinement. Yili naturally didn't have the patience to have a full month of confinement. Not to mention other things, there were too many things to do in these few months. But even so, Yili was still forced to lie in bed by Sue Air Foreign and two mamas for half a month before she was allowed to move freely. At the end of May, the Prince Ding mansion sent out invitations to the powerful and famous people of the surrounding countries, inviting them to Sir Qingyun's 80th birthday at the end of June. At the same time as the invitations, there was another piece of news. Princess Ding gave birth to a pair of twins in May, one boy and one girl. The Prince Ding mansion had a new addition. The news of Yili's pregnancy was originally only spread among the generals under the command of the Prince Ding mansion, but it had never been announced to the outside world. Although outsiders were curious as to why the Wangfei, who always went in and out with Prince Ding, didn't participate in the Battle of Chujing this time. But many people only thought that the Wangfei stayed behind to guard the northwest and didn't pay much attention. Now that the news came out, it made people envious and jealous of Prince Ding. He had just taken over the two imperial cities of Shilin-Dechu state, and the Wangfei immediately gave birth to a pair of twins. It was as if the heavens had blessed Emo Xiuyao with all the good luck. Chapter 744. Of all the people who heard the news, the angriest were Emo Jingli and Ren Qining. Needless to say, Emo Jingli and Emo Xiuyao were naturally at odds. Now that their children were a couple, they were deeply in love. But he couldn't even find his only son. How could Emo Xiuyao not be angry? In his anger, he couldn't help but remember his deep hatred for Emo Jingqi. He tormented the 7 or 8-year-old little emperor. The originally timid and weak little emperor was so scared that he cried and almost fell sick. Compared to Emo Jingli, Ren Qining was even more furious. His son, daughter, wife, and concubines were all killed by Emo Xiuyao. This kind of killing was no different from exterminating his entire family. Just like that, he had even stirred up a conflict between factions in the northern region that was not harmonious to begin with. How could Ren Qining not hate Emo Xiuyao to the core? Seeing the red invitation aimed at the golden auspicious cloud, Ren Qining was so angry that he almost spat out blood. Emo Xiuyao! Emo Xiuyao! In the study, seeing Ren Qining's ferocious expression, his trusted aides were so scared that they didn't dare to speak. After a long time, seeing Ren Qining slowly calm down, someone came forward and asked carefully, "Young master, this invitation. Are we going?" Ren Qining smiled coldly, holding the invitation tightly in his hand, as if he was holding Emo Xiuyao himself. "Go, why wouldn't we go? Not only I, the northern tribes, southern Zhao and western Tum are all going. If we don't go, won't people look down on us?" The advisor was shocked and asked worriedly, "Could it be that Emo Xiuyao is holding a banquet at Hongmen this time?" Ren Qining glanced at his subordinate and snorted. "Banquet at Hongmen? No matter how capable Emo Xiuyao is, he doesn't have the ability to trap so many people in Glass City and kill them. I just want to probe the thoughts of the rulers of each country. It just so happens that I also want to meet Yilu Yi and Lei Zhenting." Hearing his words, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Soon someone else raised a question. If young master were to go personally, I'm afraid he would have to bring along a madam. But now, it was indeed inappropriate for the ruler of a country to go on a diplomatic mission without his female companions. What's more, there were some occasions where women played an irreplaceable role. Especially in the Prince Ding mansion, when there was a Princess Ding who held real power. The distinguished guests from various countries who attended the birthday banquet would inevitably bring their women along. However, the problem now was that all the women of the northern region's royal family had been killed. Not a single one of them was left. And now the thing that gave Ren Qining a headache was also the harem. Previously, Ren Qining had married the princess of the northern region tribe as his first wife, and then he had taken in several concubines. Most of them were women from the Central Plains, which was naturally in line with the thoughts of the Central Plains officials around Ren Qining. After all, they had always regarded themselves as the legitimate descendants of the Central Plains. Although they had no choice but to borrow the power of the northern region to restore their country, they still hoped that the next emperor would be of pure Central Plains blood. So when the queen and her children were killed, these Central Plains people couldn't deny that they were secretly happy. But then the princes and princesses of the Central Plains concubines also died, and everyone realized the seriousness of the problem. And now, the country couldn't go a day without a ruler, so the harem naturally couldn't go a day without a ruler. But on the question of whether Enchanting should marry a woman from the Central Plains or a woman from the northern region, both sides couldn't persist. Originally, when the Central Plains officials were weak, it was easy to talk about it. But now that the northern region had taken over a large portion of Dechu State's land, the northern region army had rapidly expanded by a large number of people from Dechu State. As a result, the situation where the army was originally full of people from the northern region was quickly broken, and the Central Plains officials gradually had the capital to challenge. So the question of whether to marry a woman from the northern region or a woman from the Central Plains had been debated for more than half a month. The moment the two sides met, they would throw daggers at each other, mocking and ridiculing each other. They were just short of pouncing on each other to fight. Enchanting naturally leaned toward the Central Plains people. As a man, he naturally preferred the gentle and demure women of the Central Plains, compared to the rougher women of the northern region. But the people of the northern region weren't all idiots. Enchanting himself was a Central Plains person. If he were to marry a Central Plains person as his queen, then wouldn't the northern region directly change its name to that of the Central Plains? Would there still be a place for the tribes of the northern region in the future? Naturally, they would resolutely oppose it. Enchanting felt his head hurt when he thought of this matter. Originally, if he had successfully taken over the Chu capital this time, he could naturally use the name of the imperial orphan of the previous dynasty to restore his legitimacy, and these people of the northern region wouldn't be so important. Unfortunately, because of Mo Xiaoyao's interference, all his efforts had been for naught. In the future, he would naturally have to rely on these people of the northern region. It was impossible to shake them off or suppress them in a short time. Not only was it impossible, he had to support them even more. Waving his hand to interrupt the discussion, Enchanting said in a low voice, "Go back and announce Ai's decision. Confer Helan of the Taji tribe as the empress." "Young master," everyone shouted in unison. One of them stepped forward and said, "Young master, that Princess Helan is unruly and willful. How can she be the empress?" Enchanting said impatiently, "Otherwise, can you find a more suitable candidate from the northern region? Being unruly and willful also has its benefits. At least she isn't so scheming, so as to avoid annoying people." His ex-wife, the princess of the northern region, was no less scheming than a man. The northern region didn't have as many restrictions on women as the Central Plains. The princess of the northern region was originally cultivated as an heir. Unfortunately, she fell in love with Enchanting at first sight, and was willing to be a queen in the harem rather than the leader of the most powerful tribe in the northern region. Even so, Enchanting had long been impatient with the many restrictions placed on her. If Mo Xiaoyao hadn't been so ruthless, Enchanting probably would have thanked him properly this time. In addition, confer the titles of Lord Wang's eldest daughter and Lord Zhang's third daughter as concubines. With this, everyone was satisfied. When it came to palace politics, how could a woman of the northern region, who only knew how to make a scene, be a match for a woman of the Central Plains? Chapter 745. Northwest Glass City. 6 or 7 years ago, it was just an inconspicuous city in the northwest of Dechu State. However, because Prince Ding's residence was located here, it had developed into a place that connected the various countries in the western region to the Central Plains in just a few years. At the same time, it had also become one of the most prosperous cities in the surrounding countries. And now, it was connected to the westernmost Xiling Imperial City and the Chu capital Chongqing City in the east. At this point, the east-west trade route that Prince Ding's residents had painstakingly managed for several years, was finally declared complete. Glass City was destined to become a transfer point between the two sides. It was more prosperous than the West. It was only the middle of the 6th month. But there were even more people coming to Glass City. Not only were there rich merchants, noble families, and refined scholars, but there were also people in power and royalty from various countries. Suddenly, Glass City could be said to be a gathering of heroes. Originally, even though Master Qingyan was famous, if it was just his birthday, there wouldn't be so many people coming. However, when Master Qingyan was Princess Ding's grandfather, and the Su family members all held important positions in the Prince Ding mansion, everything changed. Moreover, there were also the two major events of Prince Ding's recent acquisition of 2 capital cities, and the birth of a son. Basically, anyone who could make it in time wouldn't miss out on this grand occasion. In the Prince Ding mansion in the city, Master Qingyan and Su Zhe were sitting under a shady tree and playing chess. No matter how noisy it was outside, it wouldn't reach them. As he thought about the game in front of him, Su Zhe smiled and said, "Glass City can be said to be a gathering of heroes. Master Qingyan is so lucky." Master Qingyan shook his head indifferently. "What's the point of a birthday celebration? It's not as good as a family eating a meal together. How many people in this city are sincerely here to celebrate an old man's birthday?" Su Zhe thought. Although Master Qingyan's words were straightforward, they were the truth. He smiled faintly and said, "In any case, it's the children and grandchildren's filial piety. Mr. Qingyan, please don't attack them like this." Mr. Qingyan smiled and said, "How could this old man be so insensible? Although we old men are old and weak, we can still watch a few plays." Hearing this, Su Zhe also smiled and shook his head. He slowly placed a chess piece on the table and smiled. "Now that you've said it like that, you're making those people who rushed here in a hurry feel embarrassed. Greetings, Mr. Qingyan." At the door, a servant in green said respectfully. Mr. Qingyan raised his head and asked, "What's the matter?" The manservant respectfully reported, "Fourth young master Su has returned, and is waiting outside to pay his respects to Mr. There is also a Mr. Xiaoting who wishes to see you." Su Zhe and Mr. Qingyan looked at each other. Mr. Qingyan hurriedly said, "Quickly invite Mr. Xiaoting and Qingbai in." The manservant accepted the order and left. Su Zhe smiled and said, "Chen Xiufu is also here. I heard that he helped fourth young master in Xiling. It seems that he is now sincerely loyal to the Prince Ding mansion." Mr. Qingyan smiled and said, "With his sincere help, Qingbai will be able to achieve twice the result with half the effort." As they spoke, Mr. Xiaoting and Su Qingbai walked in one after another. Su Qingbai walked in front of Mr. Qingyan and respectfully knelt down. "Grandson greets grandfather. I haven't been able to serve grandfather for a long time. Please forgive me." Mr. Qingyan hurriedly pulled him up and looked him up and down. He nodded and smiled. "Good child. You look energetic. Seems like you're doing well in Xiling." Su Qingbai smiled and said, "Thanks to Mr. Xiaoting's help, grandson is not in a hurry." Beside him, Mr. Xiaoting also hurriedly came forward and bowed. Junior Chen Xiufu greets Mr. Qingyan and Elder Su. Mr. Xiaoting had seen Su Zhe when he was traveling in the Chu capital. Even though he hadn't seen him for many years, he could still roughly remember his appearance. Mr. Qingyan smiled and said, "Xiaoting, you don't have to be so courteous. It's rare for you to come to Glass City. If there's any neglect, please don't blame me." Mr. Xiaoting hurriedly said that he didn't dare. Su Zhe invited Mr. Xiaoting to sit down and have a long talk. The three of them were rare scholars in this world. Naturally, they were very congenial when they talked. Su Qingbai saw that they were chatting happily and got up to leave to see Su Hongyu. At this time, the Prince Ding Mansion's large study was also very busy. Even Yi Li, who was usually not allowed to do this and that, was dragged to the study to do things. There were less than 10 days until Mr. Qingyan's birthday. Many of the guests who came to attend the birthday banquet had already arrived. This banquet could be said to be unprecedentedly grand. In less than a month, the population of Glass City had increased by more than 30%. Other than the guests invited by the Prince Ding Mansion, There were also merchants from various countries who came because they heard the news. There were also many scholars and tourists who came on their own to participate in this grand occasion. Needless to say, all the inns in Glass City were filled with people. There were even many people who came late, who couldn't find a place to stay. With so many people suddenly appearing, there were naturally countless problems with basic necessities, food, housing, transportation, security, and so on. There was also the balance between the nobles of various countries, the relationship between these people, and the Prince Ding mansion. What kind of agreements could be reached between the two sides, and what benefits could be obtained from each side, had to be carefully considered. It was no wonder that they were so busy. When Su Qingbai came in, he saw his father, his two elder brothers, and Mo Xiaoyao, and Yi Li sitting around a large long table. There were all kinds of thick booklets piled in front of each of them. Needless to say, there were even more booklets piled up in front of Zhuojing and the others, who were doing preliminary review and classification. When he thought about how he was so busy these few months in West Hill, that he didn't even have time to eat, he couldn't help but feel happy. It seemed that he wasn't the only one who was tired in West Hill. His father and elder brothers who stayed in Glass City weren't far behind. Prince father, eldest brother, second brother Li I'm back, Su Qingbai said with a smile. Seeing him come in, Mo Xiaoyao, who was originally sitting beside Yi Li, suddenly had a gleam in his eyes. Su Qingbai only felt a chill down his spine. Mo Xiaoyao smiled warmly and said, Qingbai, you're back. It must have been a tiring journey. Come in and take a seat. Su Qingbai couldn't help but feel flattered by Mo Xiaoyao's courteous reception. He looked at Mo Xiaoyao warily and said with a faint smile, Prince, you're too kind. It's all right. In this way, Mo Xiaoyao smiled even more happily. Since you're not tired, come, these are all yours. Mo Xiaoyao casually raised his hand and slapped Su Qingbai into the chair beside him. It didn't hurt, but he couldn't stand up either. Mo Xiaoyao unceremoniously moved all the booklets in front of Yi Li to Su Qingbai. He smiled amiably and said, I'll have to trouble you with these. Li, the doctor said that you can't use your eyes too much since you just gave birth. Let Qingbai take care of these. Su Qingbai stared blankly at the pile of booklets in front of him. When he met his eldest brother's teasing gaze, he then understood that he was obviously the coolie who had sent himself to their doorstep. How's fourth brother in West Hill? In the end, it was still Su Qingze who was kinder and asked Su Qingbai. He didn't feel that his family had become so inhumane after he left for less than a year. Su Qingbai raised his hand and flipped through the booklets in front of him as he answered, It's all right. It's almost on the right track. Chapter 746. Yi Li looked helplessly at the empty table in front of her. She turned around and took a book from Mo Xiaoyao. She smiled and said, Fourth brother, you're too humble. The West Hill has been much calmer these few months. It's clear that you've managed it well. Su Qingbai shook his head and smiled. How can you say that I've managed it well? There was quite a bit of trouble last month. This time, General Zhang could only stay behind to guard the place. When grandfather's birthday comes, I'll have to rush back as soon as possible. Su Hongyu said calmly. Managing a place isn't something that can be achieved in a short period of time. There's no need to be impatient. Su Qingbai nodded. Thank you for your advice, father. I understand. He was indeed impatient. He was too young. He had become a governor before the age of 25. Naturally, there were too many people below him who didn't like him. However, he also understood that it was just as his father had said. Managing a place would take at least 3 to 5 years. When he thought of this, his originally impatient mood gradually calmed down. With one more person, it would naturally be faster to get things done. In less than 2 hours, the documents on the table were all dealt with. Actually, these things didn't need so many people to do it. Usually, Mo Xiaoyao, Su Qingchen, or Su Hongyu would be able to do it. However, during this period of time, they didn't believe it. Each of them had many things to do, and didn't have much time to look at these reports. After dealing with the things on hand, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. In these 2 days, the rulers of various countries who liked to put on airs should be arriving. If they didn't deal with them now, they would have to wait until after the birthday banquet. However, it wouldn't be good to delay many important matters for the birthday banquet. After dealing with the matters, they asked for refreshments to be served. Only then did the family have time to sit down and chat for a while. Second brother, or first aunt Mr. Shen and Weo back? Yili frowned and asked as she ate the supplements prepared for her. Last year, when Shen Yang went to the West Hill, he had also brought Weo along. After all, he was officially learning medicine from Shen Yang. Naturally, he couldn't stay in a small place like Glass City. No matter how talented he was, he wouldn't improve much if he just read books. Su Qingbai's hand that was holding the tea paused slightly. They're all back. His mother was a little tired from the journey, so she went back to her residence to rest. Mr. Shen seemed to have some new ideas that he wanted to discuss with Dr. Lin, so he left with Wuyou. Hearing this, Yili raised her eyebrows and looked sideways at Su Qingchen. Su Qingchen smiled faintly and elegantly. Su Qingbai, on the other hand, seemed a little uncomfortable and changed the topic. Why don't I see second uncle? Su Qingchen said. Second uncle has gone to the northern tribes, but he should be coming back with the northern tribes envoy this time. Su Qingbai was far away in West Hill, and did not know much about what was going on in Glass City. He gave him a curious look. Su Qingchen then briefly explained the matters of the Moon Glass City. After listening, Su Qingbai could not help but sigh. Actually, he was far away in the Western Tomb, and could already be considered stable. In that case, after fighting for a year, we should be able to settle down for a while, right? Su Qingchen smiled faintly and said, who knows? But other than the confrontation with the northern tribes, the Mahist army should be able to settle down for a while. What plans does the prince have? In this year, the Mahist army had displayed their strength to the surrounding powers with a near-total victory. In the short term, no one would have the guts to provoke the Mahist army. However, they had to guard against the possibility of all these people ganging up against the Mahist army. Imo Shuyao leaned against the back of the chair and said lazily, rest and build up strength. I am not in a hurry. As long as they don't want to fight, they can rest first. At the same time, the Mahist army's strength is still a little lacking compared to the northern tribes in West Hill. It's a good chance to raise an army. Anyway, he did not want to be the emperor, and was not in a hurry to fight for territory. He also did not have to worry about fighting for the throne. But as long as he swallowed the territory, no one would be able to make him spit it out. Therefore, compared to the rulers of the surrounding countries, Imo Xiuyao was the most relaxed and comfortable. The king of the northern tribes was already old. The brothers Yelu Yi and Yelu Hong had been fighting openly and covertly for more than 10 years. No one knew what the outcome would be. Ren Qining of the northern region seemed to have a monopoly on power, but the conflict between the people of the northern region and the people of the central plains would erupt sooner or later. Lei Jinting of West Hill and the Emperor of Xiling had almost openly fallen out with each other. Lei Jinting, who originally had the upper hand, was greatly weakened after Imo Xiuyao's bloodbath. He was on the same level as the Emperor of Xiling. In the end, who would win would depend on whose methods were better. As for Imo Jingli, who lived in Jiangnan, and Princess Anqi of Nanzhao, Imo Shuyao did not take them seriously for the time being. What if they still want to fight? Su Qingchen asked. Imo Shuyao raised his eyebrows. If they want to fight, then fight. Do you think I will be afraid of them? Hearing this, Su Qingchen could not help but smile. Of course, if they wanted to fight, who would the Mahist army be afraid of? Reporting to the prince's consort, the king of the northern region has arrived. Qin Feng came in and reported from outside the door. Imo Xiuyao was somewhat surprised. Whether it was the distance or the friendship between the two families, Ren Qining should not have been the first to arrive. Originally, even he thought that the first to arrive would be either Lei Jinting or the Emperor of Xiling. After a moment of surprise, Imo Xiuyao pulled Yili to stand up and said with a smile, whether or not he is legitimate, he is still the ruler of a country. Li, Come with me to welcome him personally. Since they had come in the name of a birthday celebration, these people naturally had to come to the Prince Ding mansion to greet Master Qingyan. As the masters of the Prince Ding mansion, Yili and Emo Xiuyao did not come out to greet them. Yili looked at Emo Xiuyao with a faint smile and said, "I'll go with Big Brother. Are you sure the king of the northern region won't draw his sword and cut you down?" After killing his entire family, it was too much to ask for someone to greet him with a smile. Yili could imagine what expression Emo Xiuyao would have if he personally went to greet Ren Qining. Emo Xiuyao did not mind and smiled. Why would he? Since he's here, it means that he can definitely endure it. Also, do you think I will be afraid of him if he draws his sword? Although it's not good to kill the king of the northern region, if he attacked first, I won't have any qualms about it. Yili could not win against him in an argument, so she could only be dragged to greet Ren Qining. That's right, he was very excited. Even the people around them could clearly feel that Prince Ding was very enthusiastic about greeting the king of the northern region. At the entrance of the Prince Ding mansion, 2 rows of guards dressed in black stood in an orderly manner. They looked solemn as they guarded the entrance of the mansion. At the same time, they also turned a blind eye to the annoying scene in front of them, as if they did not see anything. Ren Qining, who had just arrived, was wearing the unique royal clothing of the northern region. His expression was twisted as he stared at the white-clothed, white-haired, and smiling handsome man standing at the entrance. Although he looked like a typical person from the Central Plains, Ren Qining did not look strange at all when he wore the clothing of the northern region's nomads. Instead, he looked more boorish and heroic than when he wore the clothing of the Central Plains. Chapter 747. However, this heroic aura disappeared the moment he saw Emo Xiuyao's face. Instead, it became twisted and ferocious. No matter how ambitious a person was, and how willing he was to sacrifice everything for the world, he would not have as much self-control as he thought he would have in front of the murderer of his wife and child. Especially when the murderer was smiling happily at him. Emo Xiuyao did not care what Ren Qining thought. In fact, the more unhappy Ren Qining was, the happier he was. Thus, when he saw Ren Qining's expression, he only raised his eyebrows and asked in confusion, "Northern Region King, what's wrong? I haven't seen you for 1 or 2 years, and your temperament has changed a lot. Is there something wrong with my Prince Ding mansion?" Ren Qining gritted his teeth and said in a deep voice, "Prince Ding, you must be joking. I am just a bit tired from the journey." "I see." Emo Xiuyao smiled and said, "I was not thoughtful enough. Since that's the case, why don't Northern Region King rest at the inn first? Shall I hold a welcoming dinner for the Duke of Beijing tonight?" "No need. I will greet Mr. Qingyan first as a courtesy," Ren Qining said. "Northern Region King, don't worry. Grandfather will understand." "Understand what? Do the people of the Northern Region not know etiquette?" "Prince Ding, is this the famous Princess Ding?" Seeing Ren Qining's expression become uglier and uglier, a beautiful woman beside Ren Qining asked. Emo Xiuyao seemed to have only just noticed the 2 women beside Ren Qining. They were both quite beautiful. One of the women in blue looked delicate and gentle. She was clearly a woman from the Central Plains. The beautiful woman who spoke didn't have the usual jade-white complexion of the Central Plains women. Instead, she had a healthy wheat complexion. Although she was beautiful and had an arrogant aura, she did not look arrogant. Yili took a step forward and said with a smile, "I don't deserve to be called famous, but I am Yili. May I know who this is?" Ren Qining said, "This is I's Queen Helan. This is Imperial Concubine Yun." Yili smiled in her heart. Ren Qining's action was quite fast. In just a few months, he had made up for all the wives and concubines. But he didn't forget to bring his concubines when he went out with his wife. The conflict between the natives of the northern region and the people of the Central Plains must have been very serious. Without looking at the woman in blue, Yili smiled at the gorgeous Queen Helan and said, "The Queen's presence in Glass City brings light to the Prince Ding mansion. Northern Region King, Princess Consort, please come in." Queen Helan looked at Yili and said with a smile, "Although I don't understand what you're saying, I know you're praising me. Princess Ding, I like you very much. Yili couldn't help but smile and say, Thank you, Queen, for your kindness. Please come in. Queen Helan was not polite. She walked up to Yi Li and wanted to take Yi Li's hand. Mo Xiaoyao, who was standing to the side, frowned slightly and raised his hand to block Helan's hand. Queen Helan rolled her eyes and raised her hand to hit Mo Xiaoyao. A slender hand reached out and grabbed her wrist. Yi Li looked at her with a smile and said, Queen Helan, our prince has never liked to fight with women. Let this consort play with you. Queen Helan's eyes lit up and she said with a smile, Okay. Breaking free from Yi Li's grip on her wrist, Helan pulled out a colorful whip and said to Yi Li with a smile, I heard that the princess of the Prince Ding mansion is very good when I was in the northern region, and I wanted to fight with you. I'm going to start now. After saying that, she raised her arm and waved the whip at Yi Li. Yi Li smiled faintly. Her figure moved nimbly, and she pulled out a long sword from Qin Feng's hand. With a wave of sword light, the two people fought. Helan. Queen Helan's sudden appearance was obviously out of Ren Qining's expectation. Her face darkened and she shouted in a deep voice. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care. He looked calmly at the two people who were fighting and said with a smile, Northern Region King, you don't have to care. It's just a casual fight. Li has always had a sense of propriety. She won't hurt Queen Helan. Mo Xiaoyao's words were definitely not mocking Ren Qining. Everyone present could see that although Queen Helan's martial arts were good, she was still far inferior to Yi Li, who had fought on the battlefield. Ren Qining said with a gloomy face, The queen is rude. Thank you, Prince Ding, for not blaming her. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and turned his gaze to the two graceful figures at the door. The woman in blue standing next to Ren Qining was the concubine that Ren Qining had taken with Helan when he was forced to marry her. She was the daughter of Ren Qining's confidant, so she was naturally more favored than Queen Helan, who was born in a noble family in the northern region. But today, at the entrance of the Prince Ding mansion, whether it was Prince Ding or Princess Ding, they both ignored her. This made Imperial concubine Yin, who was originally a little arrogant because of the favor, feel a little embarrassed. At this time, seeing that the Prince Ding mansion and Queen Helan had taken away everyone's attention, she was even more displeased. She couldn't help but whisper, Didn't you say that Princess Ding was born in a scholarly family? Why didn't you invite the guests in, and instead fight with them at the door? She thought that she was speaking softly, but everyone present was an expert with profound skills. Mo Xiaoyao's gaze swept past her indifferently, and a faint coldness flashed in his eyes. Yi Li and Queen Helan, who were fighting, also separated at the moment she finished speaking and returned to their original positions. Yi Li said with a smile, Queen Helan's skills are extraordinary. Why don't we have a spar when you have time? Queen Helan said with a smile. Okay, Princess Ding, you're really amazing. I admire you, and I'll make friends with you. Yi Li said with a smile. It's Yi Li's honor to have the queen as a friend. Northern Region King Queen Helan, please come in. Ren Qining looked deeply at Yi Li and said with a faint smile. Thank you, Princess. I haven't seen you for a long time, but you look as good as before. Yi Li smiled elegantly. Northern Region King is too kind. Chapter 748. After inviting Ren Qining and the others into the mansion, Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li personally accompanied them to see Mr. Qin Yin. Ren Qining and the others walked in the Prince Ding mansion and couldn't help but show a trace of surprise when they saw the scenery of the mansion's courtyards. Although the Prince Ding mansion was located in the center of Glass City, it was also the largest mansion in Glass City. But compared to the palaces of the other countries, it was naturally not enough. Even compared to the Prince Ding mansion in the Chu capital, it was still a bit smaller. Needless to say, the mansion didn't have the richly ornamented rafters and painted rafters or exotic flowers that outsiders imagined. The front courtyard where government affairs were usually handled was clean and simple, but it didn't lose its grandeur. The courtyard where people lived in daily life was also quiet and peaceful. This kind of mansion wasn't bad, but compared to Imo Xiuyao's current reputation, it was a bit shabby. Ren Qining looked at the white-haired man walking in front of her, her gaze deep. This kind of behavior, if it wasn't that he really didn't want to rule the world, then he had a bigger plan. Very quickly, Ren Qining threw the first possibility to the back of her mind. If he didn't have the idea of ruling the world, then what was Imo Xiuyao fighting wars for? Mr. Qing Yun's temporary residence was a small and quiet courtyard in the depths of the mansion. In reality, although the Prince Ding mansion wasn't big, it had all kinds of rules and regulations. Usually, many officials and generals that came and went to the front courtyard or the main courtyard where Imo Xiuyao and Yili lived. Normally, they wouldn't disturb other people, so the entire back half of the mansion was very quiet. Standing at the door, she asked the servant outside to go in and report. Yili then turned to look at the blue-clothed woman beside Ren Qining and said, "Imperial concubine Yun, please stay for now. Go to the side hall to have tea." Imperial concubine Yun was startled and looked at Yili with some dissatisfaction, saying, "This concubine came sincerely to celebrate Mr. Qing Yun's birthday. What does princess mean?" Yili frowned slightly and looked at Ren Qining. "Northern Region King, our Central Plains has never brought a concubine to celebrate a birthday. Northern Region King, please forgive us." Once she said this, Ren Qining's expression became a bit ugly. He was from the Central Plains and was born in the most orthodox royal family of the Central Plains. Even if the Lin royal family no longer existed, he didn't miss anything that he should learn. Yili's actions were clearly mocking him for his lack of etiquette. "Your Majesty," Ren Qining's face didn't give her face. She glared hatefully, and then reached out to tug on Ren Qining's sleeve with tears in her eyes. Beside her, Queen Helan gave a hearty laugh and said, "Ding Wangfei must have misunderstood. Not to mention your Central Plains, even our north doesn't have this rule. It's just that your Majesty likes Imperial concubine Yun and has her serve you. Just have Imperial concubine Yun wait outside for us to come out." The northern region indeed didn't have such a rule. The nobles of the northern region were all led by the first wife. In the eyes of the nobles of the northern region, the concubines were no different from female slaves. Basically, the nobles of the northern region would never become someone's concubine. Yili smiled, "So it's like that." As they spoke, the servant who went in to report came out and invited everyone in. Imperial concubine Yun quickly pulled on Ren Qining and looked at him pitifully. "Your Majesty." Ren Qining frowned slightly and said, "Wait outside." Junior Lin Yuan greets Mr. Qing Yun. In the small courtyard, Mr. Qing Yun was originally brewing tea. After hearing the servant's report, he let people invite Yi Li and the others in. Without waiting for Yi Li and Imo Xiuyao to go forward and introduce them, Ren Qining stepped forward and bowed slightly. Mr. Qing Yun stopped and raised his head to look at Ren Qining. He said with confusion, "Lin Yuan? Although this old man is old, I still remember that the king of the northern region is surnamed Ren?" Ren Qining smiled faintly and said, "Lin Yuan is Ren Qining." Junior Lin Yuan greets Mr. Qing Yun. At the side, Imo Xiuyao's expression was slightly cold. No wonder Ren Qining was the first to come and greet Mr. Qing Yun. Rather than saying it was to celebrate, it was better to say it was to annoy people. Back then, the head of the Su family killed the last emperor of the previous dynasty and surrendered. After that, the Su family was used by the successive emperors of Chu and had the reputation of being the head of the Confucians. Ren Qining's actions were clearly to remind Mr. Qing Yun that the Su family's current position was obtained by betraying the previous dynasty's imperial family. Mr. Qing Yun looked Ren Qining up and down for a while before saying with a smile, "So there is still a branch of the previous dynasty's imperial family. Not bad. For the northern region king to have such achievements, you should be able to comfort your ancestors." Ren Qining looked at Mr. Qing Yun and asked in a low voice, "I wish to restore the mountains and rivers and revive the imperial family. Does Mr. Qing Yun think it is possible?" "Yes," Mr. Qing Yun said. "There is nothing in the world that cannot be done." Why can't Mr. Lin have this ambition? Ren Qining's eyes flashed and he asked again. Does Mr. Qing Yin think I will succeed? Mr. Qing Yin was silent for a while before asking. If the king of the northern Jin really unifies the world, will the surname be Run or Lin? Will the world be called the northern region or the Great Qin? Hearing this, Ren Qining's expression changed slightly. He forced a smile and said, It won't be too late to talk about it after the mountains and rivers are stabilized. Mr. Qing Yin shook his head and said, If the king of the northern Jin can't make a decision, there will never be a day when he unifies the world. Ren Qining's face was slightly pale, but he remained silent and didn't say anything. Yili walked up to him and smiled. Grandpa, why are you making tea alone? Are Elder Su and Mr. Xiaoding not here? Mr. Qing Yin smiled and poured a few cups of tea for them to sit down. He smiled and said, They are playing chess in the study. I am old and can't bear to be bored, so I came out to drink a cup of tea. But where did Yu Chun and the other boys go these days? I didn't find someone to call them. Why didn't they come to see me, this old man? Yili covered her mouth and smiled. These days grandfather just let them rest. They are lying in the courtyard looking at their younger brother and sister. The two babies who were already more than a month old had now grown up. They were pink and tender, and were very cute. The three little buns led by Mo Xiaobao circled around the two babies every day when they had nothing to do. They didn't even like to play around on weekdays. How could they come to the small courtyard to listen to Mr. Qing Yun's tutoring? Grandfather is also bored in the manor. Lear let people send the boys to accompany grandfather to relieve boredom. Grandfather, don't think they are naughty. Mr. Qing Yun waved his hand and said, Forget it. Those few are more and more troublesome this year. It's not easy to be free for 2 days. 7 or 8 years old boys were at the age when cats and dogs disliked them. Mo Xiaobao, this kind of naturally intelligent little rascal, was even more difficult to deal with. He took the younger ones to play around in the Wangfu. Everyone was afraid of him. If it wasn't for Su Qingchen before, now there was Yi Li to suppress him. He was afraid that he would play around outside the Prince Ding mansion. But now for the two children who were just born not long ago, it was very rare to be quiet for a long time. Every time she saw Mo Xiaobao lying beside the cradle and talking to the babies who didn't understand anything, Yili felt that Mo Xiaobao would definitely be a good brother. Accompanying Mr. Qing Yin to talk for a while, Yili and Mo Xiaoyao accompanied Ren Qining out. Don't know which sentence of Mr. Qing Yin touched Ren Qining. When he went out, his face was still a little pale. Mo Xiaoyao and Yili just acted like they didn't see it. They ordered people to send Ren Qining and others back to the post house to rest. Chapter 749. Actually, Mo Xiaoyao was thinking too much. The baby didn't look like Su Qingchen, but like Yi Li's mother, the late Madame Su. Madame Su was one of the most beautiful women in the Su family, and was also Su Qingchen's aunt. Upon closer inspection, she looked a bit like Su Qingchen. Little Bao Bao looked like Madame Su, so she looked a bit like Su Qingchen as well. Not yet, Grandpa said to think about it carefully. We can give her a nickname first. Actually, it wasn't too late to give a baby a name before 1 year old. However, it was inconvenient to always call a baby baby without a name, especially now that there were 2 of them. Mo Xiaoyao also felt that they should think about it carefully, especially his little princess. He originally wanted to name her himself, but after a long list of names was rejected by him, Master Prince Ding began to doubt his own knowledge for the first time in his life. He couldn't even think of a nice name for his baby. Then let's give her a nickname first. What should we call her? Mo Xiaoyao looked sideways at the little boy in Yi Li's arms who was giggling foolishly while holding on to Yi Li's fingertips. He smiled wickedly. Then let's call her after little treasure Mo. Let's call her Mo Xiaobei. Yi Li could imagine the resentful look in her baby's eyes when he grew up. She rolled her eyes at him and said, Are you talking about a daughter? Little treasure Mo was good enough. It could barely be a boy's name. If she really called him Xiaobei, her son would cry himself to death in the future. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head. How can that do? I've already thought of a nickname for the little princess. Let's call her Little Exiner Mayan Lee's sweetheart. We're all here now, aren't we? Are you sure it sounds better than Xiaobei? Should she thank him for not calling her sweetheart? Little Exiner is very nice. How about Li? Mo Xiaobei, Little Exiner. Yili looked up at the sky speechlessly. Seeing how happy Mo Xiuyao was as he carried the little princess, her heart softened. Be careful then, but there's no Mo Xiaobei. My little brother's nickname is Lin. She had to stick to her bottom line. She didn't want her son to feel inferior because of a nickname. Mo Xiuyao looked unwillingly at Lin, who had almost called him Mo Xiaobei, but when he saw Yi Li's determined expression, he could only give up. Be careful, Exiner, my darling. Father likes you the most. Yi Li helplessly looked at the man who had suddenly become childish. Was it really okay to favor women over men? Many years later, the famous second young master of the Mo family would confess to the person he trusted the most that the person he loved, respected, and appreciated the most in his life was his mother. It wasn't because she gave birth to him, nor was it because she loved and raised him. It was because she had resolutely saved his name, so that he wouldn't fall into the same tragic situation as his older brother. Just thinking about it, when he was standing in the middle of thousands of people, receiving everyone's worship, someone he knew suddenly shouted, Mo Xiaobei, so-and-so is calling you. What kind of tragedy was this? Of course, the ignorant second young master of the Mo family wouldn't understand how close he had been to such a tragic fate. So he just lay in his mother's arms and smiled happily. Little Princess Xian seemed to feel her younger brother's joy, and also smiled. Yi Li smiled as she looked at the two adorably smiling babies in their arms. The smile on her face deepened. Mo Xiuyao looked at his wife, then looked at the little princess in his arms. He could only silently endure the fact that the toothless little bastard was occupying his beloved wife's arms. Each person sat down with the baby in their arms. No matter how busy she was, Yi Li would always pull Mo Xiuyao to play with the babies and play with them every day. This was really a lesson learned from the fact that Mo Xiaobao and his father seemed to be at odds with each other. Yi Li firmly believed that this was definitely because they spent too little time together when Mo Xiaobao was young. Xiuyao, what do you think of Queen Helin? Yi Li asked while teasing little Lin, with one hand. Mo Xiuyao thought for a while and frowned. She looks good. It's rare for a northern woman to be so ostentatious and no propriety. Does Li like her? Yi Li smiled and said, I always feel that this Queen Helin is very unusual, but her relationship with Ren Qining doesn't seem to be very good. Queen Helin is the cousin of Ren Qining's former wife. Since the death of the former queen, the northern region has been arguing about the choice of Queen Ren Qining. The Lin clan's confidants naturally hope that Ren Qining can marry a woman from the Central Plains as his queen. But no matter how unscrupulous the people of the northern region are, how can they easily relent when it comes to inheritance? Naturally, they won't agree. In the end, it was probably the northern region that gained the upper hand and married Helin as his queen. It would be strange if their relationship was good. Yi Li rubbed the space between her eyebrows and said, Even so, Ren Qining has gone a little too far. It would be fine if he didn't bring the queen on a visit to another country. But since he brought the queen with him, and also brought a concubine, it was clearly not giving the queen face. Even if you didn't do anything to the former queen, I'm afraid that in a few years, Ren Qining will do it himself, right? Doesn't this count as solving a problem for him? Mo Xiuyao didn't mind and smiled faintly. Doesn't he have a new problem now? And Li's feeling is not wrong. This Queen Helin is probably more powerful than the former queen. The former queen was originally the princess of the largest tribe in the northern region. Although she was a barbarian woman, her methods were also extraordinary. She was quite prestigious among the officials of the northern region. It was precisely because of this that the originally harmonious relationship between husband and wife gradually changed. And now, this one seemed to be unrestrained and unscrupulous. But who was Mo Xiuyao? If he wanted to pretend to be a pig to eat a tiger, no one in the world was better than him. Who does Ren Qining think he is? After using the people of the northern region, he wants to throw them away. I'm afraid that in the future, he won't be able to get rid of them, and will instead suffer the consequences of his own actions. Yili couldn't help but smile. In that case, it seems that my feeling is not wrong. Was Queen Helan trying to be friendly with us just now? Emo Xiaoyao said. Lili, don't worry too much. If you like her, there's no harm in making friends with her. If you don't like her, don't pay attention to her. If you want to deal with Enchanting, I have plenty of ways. Yili smiled and said, It doesn't matter. I also think that this Queen Helan is very interesting. Why don't we invite her to the prince's mansion in 2 days to have a cup of tea and chat? Emo Xiaoyao didn't oppose Yili's proposal. Lili, do as you see fit. Yili lowered her head and teased the baby with a smile. Enchanting was too complacent. She didn't know what kind of expression he would have when he was stabbed by the people around him one day. Chapter 750. Less than 2 days after Enchanting arrived at Glass City, Emo Jingli and Enchanting also arrived. Moreover, the two parties arrived at about the same time. Emo Xiaoyao and Yili were welcoming Enchanting at the entrance, when someone came to report that the Chu State's Prince Li, Emo Jingli, had arrived. Although Enchanting and Emo Jingli didn't have any conflicts, they were separated by a river. Enchanting's people also occupied a small corner of Jiangbei. As the saying goes, how can one allow others to sleep beside one's bed? Naturally, the atmosphere wasn't good when the two met. However, Yili and Emo Xiaoyao didn't mind. Because the atmosphere wasn't good when Emo Xiaoyao and Enchanting met. Previously, Emo Xiaoyao ruthlessly schemed against Enchanting. He even took advantage of Enchanting's army to take over the Emperor of Shilling City. He also killed a few of Enchanting's trusted aides. It would be strange if Enchanting wasn't angry at Emo Xiaoyao. However, even if Enchanting wanted to whip Emo Xiaoyao's corpse, he still had to calmly attend Master Qingyun's birthday banquet. Because even if he didn't come, the Emperor of Shilling would come. Now that Enchanting had lost the advantage of suppressing the Emperor of Shilling, he naturally couldn't let him mix with the Prince Ding mansion and scheme against him. Emo Jingli now had great power in his hands. Compared to a few years ago, his extravagance was even grander. Behind him were guards and eunuchs. The number of people and extravagance wasn't much worse than the emperor of a country. However, the people by his side were still Yi Ying and Princess Xixia. Now that Emo Jingli had control of the Dechu state, Yi Ying didn't become graceful and elegant. Instead, she became even thinner and more haggard. On the other hand, Princess Xixia, who stood to the right of Emo Jingli, was still as beautiful as ever. Seeing this, Yili somewhat understood why the Yi family didn't go to Jiangnan, and instead came to the northwest. Yi Ying's life in Jiangnan probably wasn't going well. Emo Jingli's expression was as cold and arrogant as ever, his eyes untainted. However, when he saw Emo standing next to Yi, he became even more sinister. Emo Xiaoyao clearly wasn't in the mood to greet him. He only raised his eyebrows slightly. Emo Jingli looked at Yi Li and Emo Xiaoyao. He then looked at Enchanting, who had obviously just arrived. He snorted softly and said, So Genom of Gojoseon is already here. Why aren't you going in? Why are you standing at the door? Enchanting didn't take his small provocation seriously. He laughed loudly and said, I was just chatting with Prince Ding and Princess Consort again. I didn't expect Prince Li to be here. Let's go in together. Oh, what are you all talking about? May I have the honor of hearing? Emo Jingli stared at Enchanting and said lightly. Enchanting smiled and said, I was just congratulating Prince Ding for having just taken over Chongqing City and having a son. It's a double blessing. Hearing this, Emo Jingli's expression instantly darkened. Enchanting was talking about Chongqing City right now. It was no different from slapping him in the face. Wasn't Chu Jing abandoned by him? Raising his eyes to look at Enchanting, Emo Jingli squeezed out a cold smile. It's not just your knees. Didn't you just take over the Emperor of Shilling City last year? Is Genom of Gojoseon heir and his family well? Chu Jing had fallen into Emo Xiaoyao's hands. But hadn't the emperor of Shilling City also fallen into Immerse hands? Not only that, Enchanting's trusted grandson and granddaughter had all been killed by Immerse. It was hard to tell who was uglier in comparison. Hearing this, Enchanting couldn't laugh anymore. Although the emperor of Shilling City wasn't lost in his hands, it was because he didn't have time to send reinforcements. Standing on the steps, Yili sighed helplessly in her heart. Choosing this time to treat them was really asking for trouble. Now all the surrounding countries didn't seem to be friends with the Prince Ding mansion, especially these two in front of her. Was it really okay to stand at the entrance and discuss the lost city, or were they hoping that Immerse would spit out what he had taken? Smiling faintly, Yili said softly, Prince Ding Mansion and Prince Ding Mansion have come from afar, and must be tired from the journey. Why don't we have a cup of tea before catching up? Hearing this, the two looked at each other with disgust. Who wanted to catch up? Besides, they didn't have anything to talk about. Leading the group into the mansion, Yili waited for the servant to serve tea before saying with a smile, Grandfather is old, and has been tired recently. I'm afraid he won't be able to see you too. Please don't blame him. Both of them knew that Master Qingyan was already 80 years old. Yili's reason naturally couldn't be found wrong. Enchanting nodded and said, We're here to celebrate Master Qingyan's birthday. How can we trouble him? It's better if we wait until the day of the birthday banquet to celebrate Master Qingyan's birthday. Yili smiled and thanked him. The atmosphere in the hall became a bit strange. The three men present clearly weren't friends with each other. Naturally, they didn't have anything to say. Yili also didn't have a good impression of Enchanting and Immerse. Thus, she wasn't in the mood to adjust the atmosphere. Tilting her head, she smiled at Immerse and said, I have something to say to fourth sister. I'll have to trouble Prince to entertain Genom of Gojoseon and Princely. Immerse nodded indifferently. Yili then stood up and said to Ying, who was sitting next to Immerse, with a faint smile, Fourth sister, let's go out for a walk. Ying clearly had something to say to Yili. She didn't say anything and stood up to follow Yili. Once the two left, only Princess Xixia was left in the hall. Princess Xixia looked at the door and stood up. I'll also go out for a walk. Soon, only the three men were left in the large hall. The atmosphere became even more solemn. After a while, Immerse laughed coldly and said, Immerse, you've got some tricks up your sleeve. Last year, everyone in the world was fooled by you, right? Enchanting looked at Immerse with a gloomy expression. It could be said that in the past year, no one had truly gained an advantage over the other countries. The one who had truly benefited was the white-haired man, who was lazily leaning on the chair. The Prince Ding Mansion didn't just gain a large piece of land and two capitals in Xiling and Dechu State. More importantly this time, the Mahist army had truly and completely gotten rid of the burden and shackles of Dechu State. Right now, no matter where the Mo family army wanted to attack, it was perfectly justifiable, and no one could say anything about it. Therefore, from the beginning, Immerse had been waiting for the northern tribes and Xiling to attack Dechu State. Because as a former subject of Dechu State, even if they had broken off relations with Dechu State, they definitely couldn't attack Dechu State first. Now this restriction had been completely broken. Although a long time had passed, and anyone could understand the mystery, it was too late now. But it was too late to think about it now. Immerse had already taken advantage of the 1 year's time. Even someone as arrogant as Enchanting couldn't help but sigh at Immerse's patience and scheming. Immerse looked lazily at Immerse, his lips curling into a mocking smile. I am magnanimous. I don't mind the loser shouting a few words. Immerse roared angrily, facing Immerse. He seemed to always be the loser. But Immerse had never had such a strong hope that Immerse had never existed in this world. Because of his scheming, he had lost half of Dechu State, lost Dechu State's capital, and could only live in a corner. Even in Jiangnan, he held great power, and his words were absolute. But every time he heard someone talking about Immerse, he seemed to hear the ridicule and dissatisfaction in their hearts. Because the capital he had lost was saved by Prince Ding. And the capital that was saved was no longer Dechu states. All of this was because of Emo. Chapter 751. Emo lazily raised his eyes. I am not here to listen to you rant. If there's nothing else, then go back to the post house and take it with you. Genom of Gojosian, do you have anything else to say? If not, then I will take my leave. Emo Jingli's face was ashen, and his tightly clenched fists made cracking noises. Enchanting, on the other hand, was a little more composed. He calmly smiled and said, Prince Ding, why are you in such a hurry? Emo Xiaoyao smiled complacently and said, I want to go back and see my little princess. The news that Princess Ding had given birth to a pair of twins was naturally known to everyone. Looking at Emo Xiaoyao's expression, it was clear that he doted on his daughter more. This made Enchanting somewhat curious. After all, to most people, sons were more important. Emo Xiaoyao only had 2 sons at the moment, which wasn't a lot. In contrast to Enchanting's calm and collected manner, Emo Jingli's face was somewhat unable to conceal his jealousy. To Emo Jingli, Emo Xiaoyao's high-profile flaunting was simply rubbing salt on his wound. I wonder if I would have the honor of meeting the Prince Ding Mansion's little princess? Enchanting asked. Emo Xiaoyao naturally wouldn't agree. My daughter has just turned 1 month old, and can't be exposed to the wind. I'm afraid that Genom of Gojosian will be disappointed. Enchanting wasn't surprised by this. His relationship with Emo Xiaoyao naturally wasn't good enough for him to feel at ease getting close to the Prince Ding Mansion's newborn child. He didn't mind Emo Xiaoyao's rejection, and only smiled faintly. That's a pity. Emo Xiaoyao waved his hand and said faintly, Genom of Gojosian, if you have something to say, feel free to say it. Enchanting lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. Prince Ding sure is straightforward. Fine. Prince Ding invited all the dignitaries of the various countries at this time, so he naturally knows what's going on. I wonder if Prince Ding has the time to speak with I alone? Emo Xiaoyao's sword-like eyebrows raised. Of course, I have no problem. There are a lot of things going on these days. How about we wait until after grandfather's birthday celebration? Enchanting nodded with satisfaction and said, In that case, I'll be waiting for Prince Ding. In the garden in the rear courtyard of the mansion, Yi was to take a stroll. She glanced sideways at Ying, who was 1 step behind her, and couldn't help but recall the Ying before her wedding. At that time, Ying was still a young girl of 14 years old. Her appearance and talent were the best in the capital, and it was the time when countless girls were envious of men. Now 10 years had passed, and the Ying in front of her was only a thin and pale figure. Even though her appearance was still as beautiful as before, she no longer had the brilliance and elegance of the past. She was like a soulless wooden beauty. Pulling Ying to sit down in the pavilion, Yili asked softly, How is 4th sister now? Ying raised her head and looked at her, her eyes flashing with countless complicated and indescribable emotions. Finally, she calmed down and smiled bitterly. How could 3rd sister not know about the Li Palace? It's just passing the days, but 3rd sister must have been living very well these past few years. Ying looked at Yi Li in front of her, and her heart was incomparably bitter. The Yi Li that she had looked down on in the past had long become an existence that she could never hope to reach. Back then, in the minister's manor, her brilliance was covered by others, and she only left the world with an ordinary and unremarkable impression. However, even if a pearl was covered in dust, it would still bloom with dazzling brilliance one day. From the beginning, Yili was different from them. Yili smiled faintly. I am indeed not bad. Now father and grandmother are also in Li City. If you have time, why don't you go and see them? Ying was slightly startled and shook her head. Forget it. I don't have the ability to give the Yi family any wealth or glory. I think grandmother and father wouldn't want to see me. From the moment the Yi family chose to seek refuge with Yi Li, who had a cold relationship with them, instead of going to Jiangnan to find her, Ying already understood. Father and grandmother actually didn't think highly of her. However, this decision was also correct. If the Yi family really went to Jiangnan, They would have no power in their hands, and could even be banished to the cold palace. How would she be able to settle the Yi family? At that time, Mo Jingli would probably vent his anger on them. On the other hand, no matter how cold Yi Li's relationship with the Yi family was, she could at least give them a stable place to settle down. Yi Li looked at the thin woman in front of her, deep in thought. Fourth sister has really changed a lot. How can she not change? Yi Ying sighed softly. Ever since she found out that the son that she had doted on and raised for several years was not her biological son, Yi Ying finally understood what kind of person Mo Jingli was. The affectionate love of the past, and the solemn vows of undying love, were already a thing of the past. Yi Ying was always faced with Mo Jingli's cold and annoyed gaze and Princess Xixia's smug smile. Although Yi Ying was both talented and beautiful, she was not someone with much political insight. In fact, because of Madame Wang's short-sightedness, she could not even compare to some of the well-bred young ladies from prestigious families in the way she handled matters. However, even so, after so many years, Yi Ying more or less understood, no matter how unwilling she was to admit it. Back then, Mo Jingli gave up Yi Li to marry her. But it was not because he only had feelings for her as she thought back then. Back then, she thought that she could attack Yi Li and trample her underfoot by the marriage, but in reality, it was just a lie to let Mo Jingli get rid of Yi Li. Now that Mo Jingli regretted his decision back then, Yi Ying could not avoid being angered. Do you still remember that I told fourth sister that if you have any grievances, you can tell me? Maybe I can help you. However, it seems that fourth sister doesn't trust me. We haven't been in contact all these years. Yi Li looked at Yi Ying, whose eyes were red, with a gentle expression and sighed softly. Third sister. Yi Ying was stunned. At the same time, she also remembered what Yi Li said to her back in the Li Palace. However, her experiences over the years were worlds apart from Yi Li's. Furthermore, the resentment in her heart made it impossible for her to swallow her pride and beg Yi Li. Now that she heard Yi Li mention it again, all the grievances in Yi Ying's heart could not help but surface. She felt that she had gone too far by picking on Yi Li in the past. At this point in time, who else in the entire Yi family would remember her other than Yi Li? Yi Ying bit the corner of her lips and whispered, Third sister, Inger begs you to help me find my child, okay? Your child? Yi Li raised her eyebrows. Back then, Mo Jingli had kicked the young heir of the Li Palace to death. Most of the people who had information channels knew the truth. However, the reason given to the public was that the Li Palace's little heir had died of an illness. Yi Ying nodded and said with a bitter smile, Third sister must know about what happened in the Chu capital 2 years ago. My child. Yi Ying could not help but cry when she thought of the child she had never seen since birth. In the past, she had also relied on her child to compete with Princess Xixia for favor. However, when she found out that her biological child was missing, she was heartbroken. If she could find her child, it would be good even if she knew that she was still alive and well. With tears in her eyes, she told Yi Li about her child being swapped by Mo Jingqi. She even told her that Mo Jingli might not have any more children. Although Yi Li already knew a lot of the situation, she could not help but sigh at how unscrupulous Mo Jingqi and Mo Jingli were. After thinking for a moment, Yi Li nodded and said, Don't worry. As long as your child is still alive, I will definitely help you find him. Chapter 752. Yi Ying was overjoyed and said repeatedly, Thank you, third sister. Third sister. Looking at Yi Ying's guilty expression, Yi Li smiled faintly and said, In the past we were all young and ignorant. Let bygones be bygones. Don't worry, you are my fourth sister. I won't let that princess of Nanjiao bully you. Yi Ying nodded repeatedly. She was even more grateful to Yi Li in her heart. Thank you, third sister. Don't mention it. It's nothing. If you have time in 2 days, go back and see father and grandmother. In the past, father and grandmother loved you the most in the family. Also, I don't want to say this, but there are many things that you really need to ask grandmother. Although Mo Jingli may not condone Princess Xixia too much for my sake, there are many things that I can't teach you. Yili reminded gently. Ying nodded. She understood what Yili was talking about. In the past, her grandmother and mother had wanted to teach her the methods of the matriarchs of noble families, but she had disdained them. Later she regretted it. She was either imprisoned by Mo Jingqi or in Prince Li's mansion. No one was willing to teach her. Until now, the power of Prince Regent's mansion was still in the hands of concubine Xian Zhao. Princess Xixia could also use some, but she, who was disliked and neglected by Mo Jingli, couldn't even touch a trace of her. In fact, when it came to the methods of noble ladies, old Madame Yi and Madame Wang couldn't teach Ying too many useful things. Old Madame Yi and Madame Yi came from small families. What they knew was very limited. If Yili really wanted to train Ying, she would ask eldest Madame Su, second Madame Su, or Empress Hua to teach her. But first, there was no such condition. Second, Yili didn't need Ying to become too smart. Seeing Yi Ying's makeup was messy from crying, Yili called for someone to take her down to freshen up. Looking at her receding figure, the gentle smile on Yi Li's face gradually faded. Qin Feng, am I being too cruel? Outside the pavilion, Qin Feng's face was calm as he said in a deep voice. Everything Wang Fei did was for the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. Besides, Princess Consort Li is not a pure and innocent person. Yili smiled faintly and said, You're right. Ying has been taught by Madame Wang to be selfish since she was young. She is grateful to me right now, but if one day I jeopardize her interests, she will definitely bite me back without hesitation. It's a pity that she won't have the chance. Yili wasn't pretending to be kind. However, Ying was indeed innocent in the current situation of the world. Unfortunately, since he had already entered the depths, if he did not have the strength to control his own fate, he could only become a chess piece in the hands of others. This was Yi Ying's fate. Or it could be said that when she chose to marry Mo Jingli, she was already destined to be a tragedy. Mo Jingli was never a good person. Yili stood up and walked out of the pavilion, just in time to see Princess Xixia coming towards her. After all these years, Princess Xixia's temperament had become much calmer. She was no longer the spoiled princess who would brandish her whip at the slightest disagreement. Seeing Yili, she just raised her eyes faintly and said, Prince Ding Mansion, isn't Ying with you? Yili smiled faintly and said, Princess Xixia, fourth sister is Prince Ding Mansion's legal wife. Isn't it a bit inappropriate for you to call her by her name? Princess Xixia raised her eyebrows disdainfully and said, So what? She is just a woman that Prince Ding Mansion dislikes. Or does Princess Ding Ding want to use her status to support her? Yili covered her mouth and smiled. Her clear and beautiful eyes moved around Princess Xixia's body. She smiled and said, How could that be? It's just that this consort is a bit curious. Speaking of which, Prince Li is deeply devoted to the princess. Why hasn't the Prince Ding Mansion given the princess a proper status in all these years? If it was in the past, it would be fine. Now that Prince Li has great power in his hands, why hasn't he thought of this? This consort remembers that the princess has long been stripped of her position as princess by Nanzhao, right? You should be called Miss Xixia. Yi Li's words instantly caused Princess Xixia's expression to become extremely ugly. These years, she had been by Mo Jingli's side. Although Mo Jingli did not treat her unfairly, he did not officially marry her. Although Nanzhao did not care about these formalities as much as the Central Plains, it was precisely because she did not have this status that even though Mo Jingli held great power now, she still could not raise her head among the noble women of Dechu State. In 2 days, the Queen of Nanzhao should be arriving. If the Queen knew that her younger sister was like this, I wonder what the Queen would think. Yili seemed to unintentionally say this with faint regret. Princess Xixia was Princess Anqi's younger sister, but she had not gotten along with her elder sister since she was young. Instead, she had been very close to the Saintess of Nanjiang, Xu Manlin. In the end, she had disregarded her status and followed Mo Jingli. It could be said that she had completely severed her relationship with Princess Anqi. Now her own sister had become the queen of a country, But she did not even have the title of princess consort. When she saw Princess Anqi, she wondered how Princess Xixia would feel. You don't need to be so smug. Prince Ding Mansion will definitely take me as his official consort. Princess Xixia said proudly. Yili pursed her lips and smiled. Miss Xixia has misunderstood. This consort is Princess Ding. Whoever Prince Li takes as his official consort has nothing to do with this consort. However, this consort still has to remind Miss Xixia that Prince Li's official consort has already been taken. Even if Prince Li marries, she will at most be an equal consort. In the Central Plains, there is no such thing as having two heads of state. Even an equal consort will have to lower her head in front of an official consort. Princess Xixia glared hatefully at Yi Li, then snorted softly and turned to leave. Chapter 753. A few days later, Princess Anqi arrived at Glass City with her husband. The messenger sent by the Emperor of Shilling arrived at about the same time as her. Although the Emperor of Shilling did not come personally, he still sent another messenger when Genom of Gojoseon was already here. Even outsiders could clearly see how tense the relationship between the Emperor of Shilling and Genom of Gojoseon was. It was unknown whether the person who arranged for these distinguished guests did it on purpose or carelessly, but they actually arranged for the messenger of the Emperor of Shilling and Genom of Gojoseon to stay in the same courtyard. After all, they were both from West Hill. As for what would happen between the two groups of people living together, it was none of the Prince Ding Mansion's business. Among all the distinguished guests, the northern tribes were the last to arrive. However, the messenger sent by the northern tribes was also quite influential. The king of the northern tribes was old, and naturally could not come. This time, the messengers sent were the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong, and the seventh prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Yi. In an instant, it could be said that the most powerful people in the world had gathered in Glass City. The last time such a grand event had happened was during Mo Xiaobao's one-month-old celebration. Yili was a little surprised to see Princess Anqi again. This was because Princess Anqi was already 5 months pregnant. In the Prince Ding Mansion, Yili saw that Princess Anqi was wearing a white queen's costume. Her usually flat belly was slightly bulging. She hurriedly asked Qing Shuang to help Princess Anqi to sit down. Why are you here when you are pregnant? Isn't your husband worried? Princess Anqi smiled brightly. Us Nanjiao women are not as delicate as you Central Plains women. It's only 4 or 5 months. Even if it's 7 or 8 months, we can still walk around. Seeing that Princess Anqi's complexion was ruddy, and did not look tired or pale at all after a long journey, Yili was relieved. After taking a closer look at her, she smiled and said, "It seems that the princess, the queen's relationship with the royal husband is not bad." Princess Anqi lowered her eyebrows and smiled faintly. Her smile became gentler when she mentioned Wang Fupue. She said with a faint smile, "He's an honest man and doesn't beat around the bush like you people from the Central Plains. Isn't it my good fortune to have such a royal husband?" Yili smiled in relief. Princess Anqi's love for Su Qingqian was destined to be unrequited. It would be great if she could find her own happiness. The two of them sat down. Qing Shuang tactfully served Princess Anqi a glass of fruit juice suitable for pregnant women before leaving. Yili looked at Princess Anqi and smiled. "Speaking of which, why did you come with the emissary of the Emperor Shilling?" Yili wasn't the only one who was curious. The others were probably wondering the same thing. Although it wasn't impossible to go from Nanjiao to Glass City through West Hill, it was much more difficult than going through Shattered Snow Pass. It was strange that Princess Anqi, who was pregnant, would go through West Hill on purpose and travel with the emissary of West Hill. Princess Anqi didn't hide it and said with a smile, "Before coming to Glass City, we went to the city of the Emperor Shilling." They were all smart people and naturally understood. Yili looked up at her and said with a smile, "You plan to work with the Emperor Shilling?" Princess Anqi sighed helplessly and said, "It's better to work with the Emperor Shilling than with Enchanting. Enchanting is now stuck in the middle of the Dechu state. There's the Mahist army in the north, and the Yunnan River in the south. If he wants to break through the current stalemate, he either has to cross the natural barrier and fight with Mo Jingli, or he has to deal with Nanzhao. Nanzhao is small, and can't compare to West Hill's strong army. We can't let him attack Nanzhao first, so we can only work with the Emperor Shilling. I only hope that the Emperor Shilling isn't an idiot, Yili said with a smile. The Emperor Shilling is weaker than Lei Zhenting, but he's really an idiot. But Lei Tingfeng is still guarding in city. Can he let you work together smoothly? Princess Anqi said with a smile. Lei Tingfeng is indeed troublesome, but he's also been a little troublesome recently. Yili raised her eyebrows curiously. Lei Tingfeng was suppressed by his father's reputation, and didn't seem to be conspicuous. He didn't seem to have any military achievements, but that was because his opponent was Mo Xiuyao. The information provided by the spies in the Prince Ding mansion was enough to prove that Lei Tingfeng wasn't a simple mediocre person. Princess Anqi said with a smile. Don't you remember? The Yanwang Chamber and Jinnan Palace have a grudge. It's just that Jinnan Palace has been too powerful these years. No matter how powerful the Yanwang Chamber is, it's still a Jianghu organization. Naturally, it can't do anything about it. Now that the Emperor Shilling has just moved to An City, Jinnan Palace's power has been greatly weakened. Lei Tingfeng's life in An City isn't easy either. I see. Yili nodded and said with a smile. I don't know what kind of grudge Ling Taihan has with Lei Zhenting. It doesn't seem to be a deep grudge. If it really was a blood feud, with the strength of Ling Taihan and the Yanwang Chamber, it was very likely that they would rush up to Lei Zhenting and fight to the death with Lei Zhenting. However, Ling Taihan didn't make any moves, and he didn't really attack Lei Zhenting even after several encounters. It shouldn't be an unresolvable blood feud. Princess Anqi stroked her slightly protruding belly and said with a smile, I heard about this from the Emperor Shilling. It seems to have something to do with the deceased consort Jenin of Gojoseon. Consort Jenin of Gojoseon passed away not long after giving birth to Lei Tingfeng. It's said that her death was a bit strange. The Emperor Shilling didn't say the specifics, so who knows? Yili frowned slightly and thought for a bit. If you really plan to work with the Emperor Shilling, it's best to investigate this matter thoroughly. Although I'm Tower Master Ling, this is a very important matter. It'll be very troublesome if someone stabs you in the back at a critical moment. Princess Anqi's face warmed, and she nodded with a smile. I know, thank you for reminding me. They all knew that there was no permanent peace and friendship between countries. Perhaps they might turn against each other in the future. But at least now Princess Anqi knew that Yili truly cared about her. Let's not talk about these annoying things, Yili said with a smile. Princess Xixia came to Glass City with Mo Jingli. Do you want to see her? Princess Anqi frowned slightly and shook her head. Forget it, she doesn't treat me as her older sister, so I'll treat her as if I don't have a younger sister. For so many years, she followed Mo Jingli without any status. For Mo Jingli, she revealed so many secrets of Nanzhao. What happens to her in the future will depend on her luck. But I haven't seen your little heir and little Canton princess yet. Yili smiled. What's so difficult about that? She turned and asked Qing Shuang to bring the two little buns over. She also asked Qin Feng to invite the little heir over. After a while, Mo Xiaobao appeared at the door like a gust of wind. Mother, are you looking for me? Seeing that there was an outsider sitting next to him, the innocent smile on Mo Xiaobao's face gradually disappeared and was replaced with a polite and appropriate smile. Yili smiled and waved at him. This is Queen Anqi of Nanzhao. Come and greet her. Mo Xiaobao then came forward and said loudly, Mo Yuchen greets Queen Anqi. Chapter 754. Princess Anqi's smile widened at the sight of the handsome boy bowing to her. She turned to Yi Li and said, You are indeed the little heir of the Prince Ding mansion. My 7 or 8-year-old child is still playing in the palace. As a mother, she always liked to hear others praise her child. Yi Li smiled and said, Don't be fooled by how well-behaved he looks now. He is usually very noisy. Princess Anqi thought for a moment, then took out a blue gem and handed it to Emo Xiaobao. She said with a smile, I forgot to prepare a gift for our first meeting. This is for you to play with. Don't dislike it. Emo Xiaobao took it with both hands and said in a steady voice, Thank you, Your Majesty. Princess Anqi looked at his serious expression and couldn't bear to part with it. If my child can be 70 to 80% as good-looking as the little heir, I will be satisfied. Emo Xiaobao blinked and said in a crisp voice, The queen is like a phoenix. Whether it is the little prince or the little princess, they will naturally be handsome and extraordinary. Princess Anqi was amused. Then I thanked the little heir for his auspicious words. After greeting Princess Anqi, Emo Xiaobao handed the gem to the person behind him and walked to Yi Li's side to sit down properly. Princess Anqi saw that he was not only handsome, but also well-mannered in his words and actions, as if he was born with a noble aura. She couldn't help but sigh inwardly at how lucky Yi Li and Emo Shuyao were. She lowered her head and stroked her slightly protruding belly, feeling even more expectant. Princess Consort, the young master and the young princess are here. Two wet nurses walked in with two babies in their arms. Emo Xiaobao's eyes lit up as he stared fixedly at the two babies in Yi Li and Princess Anqi's arms. The two babies were very well behaved. They didn't cry or make a fuss even when they were in the arms of a complete stranger like Princess Anqi. Lying in Yi Li's arms, the babies seemed to feel their mother's warmth and all of them smiled. Emo Xiaobao stretched his neck to take a look. This one likes to smile so much. He must be your younger brother. The two newborns in the Prince Ding mansion didn't like to cry, and the younger brother, Lin loved to smile even more. As long as he wasn't asleep, he would giggle when someone teased him. Of course, that was only if the person who was teasing him wasn't Prince Ding, Emo Xiaoyao. Princess Anqi held Xian in her arms and patted the baby's swaddling clothes stiffly. She sighed enviously and said, Princess Consort and Prince Ding are so lucky. The three little princes and princesses are so adorable. Yi Li smiled faintly and said nothing. After seeing Princess Anqi off, Yi Li brought the two babies back to their rooms before going to the study in the front yard. Just as she reached the garden in front of the study, she bumped into Emo Jingli. Looking at Emo Jingli's sinister expression, Yi Li couldn't help but want to avoid him. Although she wasn't afraid of Emo Jingli, she didn't want to see him act as if someone owed him 5 million taels and wouldn't pay her back. It was only a slight pause, but Emo Jingli had already seen her. Naturally, she couldn't turn around and leave. Yi Li could only go forward and nod faintly. Princely. These days, the Prince Ding mansion had been very busy with several important tasks. Not only were they busy with the Prince Ding mansion and the birthday banquet, but there were also people like Emo Jingli, who had nothing better to do and came over to chat. However, she didn't know what Emo Jingli wanted to talk to Emo Xiaoyao about today. But looking at Emo Jingli's expression, she knew that the discussion had failed. Emo Jingli stood in front of Yi Li. He didn't say anything and just stared at her. This kind of gaze made Yi Li frown in displeasure. She said faintly, If Princely doesn't have anything to say, this consort still has matters to discuss with our prince. I'll take my leave. Emo Jingli looked at her and said, Do you have to speak to me like this? Yi Li was startled and didn't know what to make of his words. She looked at Emo Jingli in confusion. She didn't understand what he meant at all. She didn't think that her words and actions were rude. Emo Jingli seemed to be impatient. He stared fiercely at Yi Li and said, When I broke off the engagement with you, did you hate me so much that you had to help Emo Shuyao go against me? Now that Emo Shuyao has taken the Chu capital, are you satisfied? Yi Li couldn't help but roll her eyes and ask the heavens. What kind of logic was this? Exhaling slightly, Yi Li said calmly, Your Highness Princely, I think you should remember that after you gave up on the Chu capital, the Prince Ding mansion went to rescue the Chu capital. No, to rescue Chongqing. We didn't take it from you. Emo Jingli choked and said stiffly with a heavy expression, Even so, it still belongs to the Dechu state. Furthermore, wasn't the northern tribes in northern Jin attacking the Dechu state part of Emo Xiao's plan? If you didn't help Emo Xiao, would he have taken down Xiling so quickly? Yili was so angry that she laughed. Your Highness Princely, what does the northern tribes in northern Jin attacking the Dechu state have to do with our prince? Could it be that it was our prince who instigated them to attack the Dechu state? Also, I am Princess Ding. If I don't help my husband, who should I help? Also, many years ago this consort said something to the prince. I don't know if the prince still remembers it. Emo Jingli frowned slightly. It was clear that he didn't understand what she was talking about. Yili said slowly, delusion is an illness that needs to be treated. I ask that prince consider it carefully. This consort will take her leave. After she finished speaking, she ignored Emo Jingli's reaction and walked around him towards the study. Yili! Emo Jingli suddenly shouted and reached out to grab Yili's wrist. But how could Yili be a weak woman? How could she be so easily grabbed by him? She raised her hand and blocked Emo Jingli's hand. Emo Jingli said in a deep voice, I have something to say to you. Yili calmly said, this consort has nothing to say to Princely. Emo Jingli's other hand reached out to grab Yili's arm. Yili dodged to the side, and a cold light flashed from her sleeve, increasing the distance between the two of them. She raised her hand to stop the shadow guard that was secretly protecting them. Yili stared at Emo Jingli and said, Princely, this is the Prince Ding mansion. It is not a place where you can do whatever you want. Emo Jingli was silent for a moment, and then said in a deep voice, I have something to say to you in private. Yili frowned and said, this consort has already said that there is nothing to say to Prince in private. This consort respects you as a guest and asks Princely to conduct himself with dignity. Goodbye. With that she turned and left. Emo Jingli wanted to chase after her, but two black shadows flashed in front of him. Two guards in black stood in front of Emo Jingli and said, Princely, please conduct yourself with dignity. Looking at the two people in front of him who were obviously skilled, and then looking at Yili who was already far away, Emo Jingli finally snorted and left in a huff. When he entered the study, Emo Xiao was sitting in the study, reading a book. When he heard footsteps, he raised his head and saw Yili. He could not help but smile. Princess Li, has Princess Anqi left? Yili nodded and said, I just met Emo Jingli in the flower garden. He looks so strange. What did you talk about? Emo Xiao reached out and pulled Yili into his arms. Being forced to sit on someone's lap, Yili was embarrassed for a moment. Emo Xiao smiled faintly. He waved his hand and a gust of wind slammed the door. Emo Xiao said with a smile, what else could it be? She scolded I for being despicable and taking advantage of people's difficulties. She also wanted to see if she could take back Chongqing City. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.